Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to welcome you all to this roundtable on trade, climate adaptation, and climate resilient development. I'm Christoph Bellman, the head of policy analysis and strategy at TESS, Forum on Trade and Environment and ESDGs, and I will be sharing our first session this morning. Maybe just a few introductory words before we start. Well, as you've seen, I think the idea of this session is really to look at the link between trade policy, climate adaptation, and climate resilient development. In the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion on the trade and climate interface, but most of it has focused on concerns around climate adaptation. Yet we know that for most developing countries, SDGs, LDCs, SIDS, and other vulnerable countries, adaptation to climate change remains a top priority, but also how to build climate resilient development. And just as trade is probably going to be a key part of the solution to climate change, trade and trade policies is also probably critical to building climate adaptation and climate resilient development. We know that climate change will affect trade, will affect trade infrastructure, will affect supply chains, and it's already affecting supply chains in many ways. In sectors like agriculture, fisheries, we also see climate change affecting yields, affecting productivity, affecting natural resources, endowment, and ultimately comparative advantages and global trade flows. So there's a whole agenda here that needs probably to be looked at much more in detail. Interestingly, in recent years, I think the trade community has started to realize that the role that trade can play in supporting adaptation goals. At the last WTO ministerial conference, in the ministerial declaration, there is a recognition of the short-term crisis caused by natural disasters by members, and the ministers call on WTO bodies to work preparedness for risk. There's also an interesting reference to climate adaptation this year, decision on the work program on small economies, which instructed members to explore relevant WTO bodies how to integrate trade-related climate change adaptation. There start to be some kind of recognition of these issues. But we thought that it would really be interesting to have an in-depth kind of reflection on what are some of the key trends and policy developments and the challenges and opportunities for trade-related cooperation on the climate risk and impact adaptation, climate resilient development. And the idea here is really to focus on the priorities of some of the more vulnerable developing countries. So that's the general idea. We'll have two sessions today. The first will really look at trade and climate trends relevant to adaptation and climate resilient development. What is happening out there? What do we know about the impacts? But also, what do we know about recent trade-related initiatives and measures at the national and regional level to support resilience to climate impacts and development? That will be our first session. Our second session will focus a bit more about avenues and strategies for cooperation, international cooperation in this area on the trade. At the beginning of each session, what we'll do is we'll have thought starters who will share their perspectives, short interventions, 5-minute interventions, just to get the. And after that, we will have an interactive discussion among participants. So that's a little bit the objective for today. Before we start the first session, what I suggest we do is a very quick tour de table, just to know who is around the table, their name and affiliation, so that we know a little bit who's around. And maybe let me start.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and Pakistan's permanent
I'm actually not Loretta. She's coming later. I'm Kristen Meyer with the UNDRR.
I'm Anne Hamill with the International Institute of Animal Development.
I'm Jody Keane.
I'm Carolyn Dearback with TESS.
I'm Mohit Chaubey from Geneva Graduate Institute.
UN Lawi from Vanuatu.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pradip Palmer from Vanuatu as well.
I'm Louisa Ledled from the Ministry of Trade, Vanuatu.
Hello, I'm Olivia Cook from the Mission of Chile to the WTO.
Hi, good morning. My name is Carol Miranda from the Mission of Cabo Verde.
Morning, I am Ana Lizano from the Mission of Costa Rica to the WTO.
Chantaline Carpentier, Head of Trade, Environment, Climate Change at UNCTAD.
Yasmin Ismail from TESS.
Matthew McGillen from the Global Center on Adaptation, and our.
Hi everyone, I'm Maureen Wanzola from WMO.
Good morning everyone, I'm Chimi Randes, DG for Trade Vanuatu.
Thank you, and I think online we have Laura Kelly, if you want to just introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Sorry, I can't be there in person. Laura Kelly from the International Institute for Environment and Development.
Thank you. I have also online Brendan.
Just ask him to introduce himself.
I mean, Brendan, because
yes,
maybe just make sure, ask him to introduce himself.
Brendan, can you introduce yourself? I have also Richard Tarasovsky.
Maybe just read through.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, there's no camera option that I can see. But hello, Richard Tarasovsky from the Mission of Canada.
Claudia?
Hello, not sure if everyone can hear me. My name is Claudia Hoffmann. I work for GIZ in Germany.
Perfect. Courtney?
Oh, hi, I'm Courtney at ODI, just tuning in remotely. Yeah, thank you.
I have Dale.
Hi, everybody. Dale Honig, retired World Trade Organization Trade and Services Division member. Also IUCN Tourism Protected Areas member.
Next is Ilukia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ilakya. So I'm from India. I work at Nalsar University of Law. I teach there. I'm an academician. Thank you.
Shira.
Hello and good morning. I am Shira Graubart and I am an external affairs specialist at FMC, which is an agriculture science company.
Thank you. Nala?
Thank you so much. I'm Nala from the Mission of Egypt. I'm sorry, I have a technical problem with my camera, so I cannot open it. Good morning.
Thank you. I see Brendan now.
Hi, good morning, Christoph. Sorry, there was something, my laptop was freezing. I'm Brendan Vickers from the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, leading the trade policy work.
And then I have someone called HP. And someone called MH. I don't know if these are. Anyway, thank you. I think we should just get started. So our session, as I mentioned, is really about setting the scene, looking at trade and climate trends, relevant for adaptation and climate resilient development, looking at some of the latest development in this area, looking at some of the sectors that are more susceptible to extreme weather events and climate impact, and some of the trade implications for developing countries, including vulnerable economies, LGBT budgets, but also some of the recent trade-related initiatives and measures that have been undertaken. For this, we have four excellent thought starters, and we'll ask them to focus on highlighting here a few key questions, not only for them, but also for the audience to think about what are the greatest trade-related climate risks, in which sectors are most impacted, what are the challenges and priorities for developing and vulnerable economies, what trade-related policy measures and initiatives are being or should be mobilized to address climate impacts and climate resilient development, what are their limitations, and where is the potential to do more? Where are the gaps? And finally, what would the trade policy agenda on adaptation and climate resilient development look like? So a series of wide range of questions, and we'll start immediately with Maureen Panzala, who is a scientific officer.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and many thanks for inviting me to this meeting to share some insights on climate-related risks and how we can collaborate in terms of how different sectors are affected. I hope I'm loud enough. A little bit louder. Sorry. We'll try better. Okay, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a climate scientist, meteorologist. I work and support the World Climate Research Program at the WMO, and we coordinate the World Climate Research Program around the globe, and we have key projects that we work head towards improving or promoting climate research that informs climate policy across the globe in different sectors. And so to just start off my thoughts, I will just give you a brief introduction of our program and how climate risks have evolved across the globe, as we have all experienced. And we can see that climate change is here with us, and the risks have been experienced across the globe. And even with anthropogenic climate change, even with 1.5-degree warming, it brings very significant challenges and risks across that affects most of the populations across the globe. And we have seen this with these extreme events across the globe, including droughts, the heavy rains, flooding, heat waves across most parts of Europe, extreme fire, and loss of mountainous water storages across the globe. And those are just a few of the climate extremes that have been experienced. So we will continue to experience this, and they will affect a big magnitude of people across the globe, and the impacts are amplified on different scales because these extreme events are now more extreme in terms of magnitude and frequency. And if you look at the recent survey from the World Economic Forum, these risks translate into different, they are interconnected in terms of different ways. We have both the economic, the ecological, the geopolitical, societal, and technological risks. So we cannot sort of like treat each of the risks independently, but rather they are all interconnected, and climate plays a big role in these risks that affect most of the societies. And so at WMO, next slide please. At WMO, we have developed a new WCRP strategic plan for this decade. And the main purpose of mission for this is to coordinate and facilitate international climate research, to develop and share applied climate knowledge that contributes to societal well-being, that coordinates and facilitates all these sectors that are affected by the climate change. And climate change affects all sectors, cross-cutting, hydro or water sector, agricultural sector, industry, transport sector. So our scientific objectives, we have 4 scientific objectives in our program, and they do cross-cutting climate research that informs policy across all these sectors. Next slide, please. So our World Climate Research Program is organized in such a way that we run core projects, and the core projects address different research ideas in different subjects, as you can see on the bottom part of the figure on the graph on the left. And then we have major science that is addressed with these core projects, and the core projects are coordinated by the international project offices. And we have the WCRP Secretariat at the WMO that coordinates this. But then we also have the lighthouse activities. Next slide, please. The lighthouse activities, which are cross-cutting climate research programs that implement, that help to improve research programs that have been addressed by the research gaps that exist that affect all these sectors. And for example, we have different things that we look at. For example, we have explaining and predicting assisting change of my climate risk, which is a framework for assessing and explaining climate risk so that climate information is meaningful, but not only on the global scale, but also on the local scale, among other lighthouse activities. And so to achieve this, next slide please, to achieve this, we have a coordination of global research networks that we work with or coordinate with that are able to sort of inform different sectors, spanning from water, oceans, climate, land, biodiversity, society, governance, etc. And these are just for the Future Earth global research networks that recognize a huge variety in which research can inform different sectors to be able to coordinate and implement policies that are relevant to different sectors to help and reduce the impact of climate change. And so also to advance that, we have implemented WCRP Academy. And sorry, the WCRP Academy is, the main aim is to determine climate research education needs through training of different stakeholders, different sectors, to be able to build an enabling mechanism by working with all the core activities and education providers to improve and inform climate literacy across the globe in all sectors. And this one is, the main aim is to advance climate science for sustainable future. And we are soon launching the new fellowship, which is coming up, to be able to sort of like support early career researchers who will be able to sort of improve or develop the climate information or climate science to be able to continue informing climate policies across the globe. And one of the successes is we held a very big open science conference in Kigali and last year, 2023, and we had a Kigali Declaration, which supports and requires urgent societal and technological transformation, both at global scale for immediate attaining of net zero carbon emissions. And this one was attended by different stakeholders in different sectors that were contributed into developing of this Kigali Declaration to inform different climate policies in different sectors across the globe. So that is just a brief introduction of World Climate Research Program that we contribute other than that. But the main aim that we do is we ensure that we work with different programs like the World Weather Research Program, Early Warning for All initiative, and the other WMO programs that work towards delivery and mild hazard early warning information to all the sectors that are able to improve or inform policies across the globe. And a good example is in the just recent concluded WMO Executive Council, the 78th WMO Executive Council. They also promoted the need for global observations to be able to inform research across different programs to inform better climate decisions in different sectors. And they implemented a plan on global greenhouse watch, as well as Earth system modeling, observation and prediction and information, and how well or how significant it is to bring climate information and society to be able to help different sectors that are informed by climate research. I think by that I come to an end to that. And in case you have any questions, I'm more than happy to have a chat on our programs and how climate is important for all these sectors for climate information.
Thanks a lot, Maureen, for this introduction and this overview of what the WMO is doing in this area. Next on my list is Anne from ISD.
Great, thanks, Christoph, and thanks. Good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm just going to have a few comments about what we're thinking about at IISD in terms of in trade and adaptation. I think we've recognized for a while now that the trade and climate conversation has been gathering a lot of momentum, a lot of interest. A lot of this has been focused on mitigation. And then even when it has looked at adaptation side of things, it's always largely been on how climate change will impact trade. So how it'll affect the trade infrastructure, how it'll affect important sectors in trade. And so our interest was, of course, that, but we kind of wanted to flip the narrative a bit or look at the reverse starting point. And so, if you start from the point of what do countries, especially vulnerable countries, least developed countries, and SIDS, when you think about what they've identified as priorities for adapting to the impacts of climate change, what is the role of trade in allowing that to happen? What can trade bring to these countries in implementing their adaptation priorities? So it's similar, but it's kind of the reverse, if you will. Their starting point is from the adaptation priorities. And so IISD actually hosts something called the National Adaptation Network. It's almost 10 years in existence now. And this is, developing countries who have been developing national adaptation plans to identify and address their medium and long-term adaptation priorities. And so using what's articulated in those, as well as what might appear in NDCs, nationally determined contributions, because sometimes developing a national adaptation plan can take many years. And so sometimes they'll sort of decide to at least articulate at a higher level their adaptation priorities in an NDC. So that's a bit of a sidebar, sorry. But looking at those, what can we say about trade? And so, when you look at the key priorities that appear in NAPs, it's pretty strong messaging, strong signaling in terms of the priorities that are that developing countries are identifying for adaptation. So it's unsurprisingly agriculture and food security, it's health, it's water and sanitation, it's also ecosystems, and then infrastructure, human settlements, and then energy and tourism. So those are sort of the top sectors that appear consistently throughout these national adaptation plans. And so then the question becomes, okay, what are the actual measures that countries are putting forward to promote the resilience in these sectors, to help with adaptation in these sectors, and then start matching what role can trade play in helping countries, whether it's access the goods and services needed to implement these adaptation priorities, whether it's accessing different services needed in sort of extreme events, and also maybe sort of a broader resilience building agenda. So we've identified sort of three broad entry points, if you will. It's sort of broad, and I think this is sort of where trade and climate change or trade and development is already, proven a lot and demonstrated a lot about the sort of economic benefits and the overall sort of economic resilience building of trade. So that's really critical for adaptation. And so how can that maybe be adjusted a bit more to understand the sort of risk and vulnerability profile of a country? And then looking at the specific measures that a country puts forward in their priority sectors and what are the different goods and services that are needed to implement them, and what are the goods and services that other markets might need and that a country might then respond to. And then it's the disaster risk reduction agenda, if you will, recognizing that there's going to be an increased frequency and probably severity of many extreme events. And so what can trade do there? And I know that there's also been quite there's been some analysis on that as well. So that's what we're looking at. And we're working with countries now who have developed these national adaptation plans to sort of understand their starting points and then sort of broker some important linkages to the sort of the trade side of government, which is probably going to be the biggest effort in all of this. I think, intellectually drawing links about how these agendas can come together is actually it can be pretty straightforward. You're looking at the tech transfer, technology cooperation, IP issues. You can sort of understand how these all kind of match up to help countries implement their adaptation priorities. But it's actually getting the different parts of government speaking to each other and understanding each other, understanding each other's language. The trade part of government, really understanding how adaptation, A, what adaptation is, B, how a country will determine adaptation priorities, and C, sort of unpacking what addressing these priorities mean. And so that's going to be, I think, a big part of the effort we're going to have over the next few years in undertaking this initiative we have on the nexus of trade and adaptation. So it's socializing adaptation in the trade parts of government, and then the reverse, right? Getting the adaptation parts of government to really understand what role trade can play. And we're already seeing in some national adaptation plans an acknowledgement that that trade has a role to play. And we're seeing that more and more, I would say. Right now, there are about 56, 57 national adaptation plans that have been submitted to the UNFCCC. We expect that number to increase quite dramatically over the next couple of years because of the support offered to developing countries in particular to develop them. But taking the focus away just from developing countries, I should also note that 85% of the countries in the world have a national adaptation planning instrument. So adaptation priorities have been articulated in almost all countries. There's probably about 15 to 20 countries where there hasn't been any evidence of a planning process underway. So there's a lot out there to work with as a starting point. I guess just wanting to say that getting this conversation going and sort of demystifying the jargon, the agendas, the processes is going to be absolutely critical, I think, for driving this forward. And I think that's all I wanted to start off this morning with, so thanks.
Thank you, thanks a lot, and I think that's really good to frame our discussion this morning. This idea of using national adaptation plans as starting points and looking at what is the role of trade and how do you in a way operationalize this in practice. Jody.
Yes, thank you very much, Christoph. So good morning, everyone. Really, really pleased to be here and really welcome this focus on adaptation. So I'm going to share some of the findings that are emerging from some of our work that's looking at how development pathways are shifting. And so we're looking at kind of conventional strategies to advance structural economic transformation, and then the extent to which those are drawing on the adaptation imperative, are taking into account the physical effects of climate change that are happening now, in terms of the production structures on the ground. So we've got a set of case studies and researchers that we're working with, and I'm very pleased that Courtney is on the line because he's been leading the work with, for Jamaica. We've been looking at Bangladesh. It's obviously one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. It's the least developed country. It's kind of trying to move towards graduation from LDC status. We've been looking at Ethiopia, and it's not yet a member of the WTO. It's in its accession process. And we've been looking at Kenya and Kazakhstan in addition to Jamaica. So we've been trying to kind of work to develop a kind of strong conceptual framework. And we did develop a conceptual paper last year that I'm happy to share and to put in the chat. But what we tried to do is to kind of break down the kind of spillover effect. So we've got the adaptation effect, and then you've got the kind of spillover effects of mitigation policy elsewhere. And we looked at the kind of combined effects of these two in terms of the effects on goods, services, technology, and the movement of people. And we just found that it was those latter two aspects that really, don't receive that much attention. So when we're working with our researchers in country, what we can see is that in terms of how structural economic transformation strategies are adapting to these kind of combined effects, it's really a kind of doubling down of existing strategies to advance structural economic transformation. So really the key message, I think, that's arising, and we're still not quite there in terms of being able to publish and present the research to you, but it's really thinking about the role of structural economic transformation as an adaptation strategy. So if you've got the risks on, rain-fed agriculture, you can see in the case of Ethiopia, Kenya, growth in the agricultural sector is high. The fluctuations of just the numbers just move up and down together, basically, in terms of rainfall and so on. So you've got that imperative of, trying to reduce the vulnerabilities there, movement into light manufacturing. Ethiopia has been really putting a strong emphasis on this for a number of years, similarly in the case of Bangladesh. So we can see this kind of doubling down of existing efforts, but we've also used this term, the green squeeze, in order to draw attention to these kind of combined effects on producers within value chains. So we know there's a lot of literature on how increased costs of compliance are passed down supply chains. But then when you bring in this adaptation aspect, it then brings in this other dimension. So just to kind of highlight with regards to Bangladesh and Ethiopia, what I mean here. So in the case of Ethiopia, the coffee production, for example, accounts for a large share of agricultural output, employment, incomes for households, and so on. And it has to move up to higher altitudes because of the physical effects of climate change. And we've known this, for kind of decades, that this is on the cards. But now there are risks of producers kind of falling foul of new green trade measures like the EU deforestation regulations. So it's these kind of combined effects that we've been trying to draw attention to. In the case of Bangladesh as well, as I mentioned, you've got a kind of doubling down of existing efforts to, stimulate the growth in the manufacturing sector, diversify and so on, but then firms are having to adapt to new supply chain measures, and the data does suggest that the burden, the cost tends to fall hardest on those smaller producers as well. Bangladesh, is kind of working through these issues, has a strong role of the private sector, business associations and so on. In the case of Ethiopia, Ethiopia is asking for more time, and it's asking for more support in this context. So in terms of the implications for trade policy, as I mentioned, Ethiopia is still in the process of accession. In the case of Bangladesh, it's about to be on that graduation trajectory, but it's not yet a member of plurilateral discussions at the WTO, so it's not yet a member of the TESS, and I'm not sure as to the reasons for that. Is it because of capacity constraints or whatnot? But what we are very keen to do in terms of advancing this work stream is to try to change the dynamics from what we have at the moment, which tends to be kind of quite a punitive green trade agenda. How do we change those dynamics so that it's much more a facilitative green trade agenda? It really brings in this role of adaptation, raises the issues of technology transfer to the same level as climate finance, for example, because we really do need to change these dynamics. The countries that we're looking at, and maybe Courtney might want to jump in the case of Jamaica, but we're already kind of at the limit of the global temperature rise to 1.5. We're almost there already. That this is kind of the limit at the current time. So just to kind of wrap up, I really like the suggestions and the presentation about the kind of global observation and ensuring that the right information is transferred to sectors and societies. And just to kind of flag the message that's coming up from the case studies, and it's also coming up from other work streams that we have. which is looking at small island developing states, is that still the data tends to be quite highly aggregated. So it really needs to really come down to that, that community level in order to ensure that information on the risks are really transferred, and that local knowledge and systems there are kind of involved in working through the solutions, because we're quite conscious that there's just we're not going to have it's not going to be one size fits all. It's going to work, bridging these two aspects: adaptation, mitigation, the spillover effects that are coming. That we're going to have to have very highly context specific approaches to this. So thank you for inviting me here. It's kind of a bit of a whirlwind overview of what we're doing at ODI, but I think once we get more into the case studies and we finalise them, I hope we can also share them with this group as well.
Thanks a lot, Jodie, and I think you highlighted a few interesting aspects. I mean, this idea of the green squeeze, that we should not only look at adaptation, but also at the kind of negative spillover effect of mitigation policies in third countries. This idea also of structural economic transformation as a tool for adaptation, I think it's quite important. And this, I think, this idea of moving from a punitive trade agenda towards a more kind of facilitative discussion. So all good elements. Our last discussion starter is Matthew McKinnon, founder and executive director of ADOA and senior advisor at the Global Center.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Good morning, and thank you to yourself and colleagues, Carolyn and colleagues, for organizing this discussion. It's really important to have these debates. There's so much that is moving so fast in the climate change space, and the implications are really substantial, I think, particularly in the area of trade, where maybe not enough has happened so far. And so it's good to see that you're getting initiatives like this underway. Focus everybody. I think I found the questions really helpful, and I'm going to try and answer some of them, even very specifically, although forgive me if I'm going to wander a little bit in the process. And I think it's also great that you have here Pakistan, Vanuatu very well represented, because obviously we have to be listening very carefully to what challenges that countries on the climate front lines are experiencing, if we're going to design effective responses. So I think that's really great that you're all here. Maybe just to start off, I'm going to take a stab at actually naming a couple of sectors that I think are most particularly impacted. I've had the chance to edit a few global studies on the impact of climate change, looking at impacts across every sector, across all countries, essentially, or in at least more than 180 in particular cases. And I think obviously the one in terms of trade that kind of jumps out would be the food and agricultural sector. Last summer, for instance, you had breadbasket regions of China that lost 40% of their rice crop. If a country like Bangladesh, or it could be Pakistan, is 1/3 underwater for more than a couple of days, obviously the entire agricultural production is basically lost. And if this trade in the area of food, and by the way, obviously somebody mentioned fisheries, but fish stocks are also affected heavily by changes in temperature gradients in the ocean. This is some kind of frontier area of understanding still, but it's possible that the impacts would be really significant. I mean, coral reefs coming from Vanuatu, they're more or less the first ecosystem that basically goes extinct, and it supports a quarter of marine life. So, these types of impacts are happening in a very networked global trade system. So, if you have multiple shocks to food supply in breadbasket regions of different parts of the world at the same time, you would obviously have pretty significant effects on global food prices. And that is going to affect directly into people's pockets wherever you are, even if you're in Switzerland, but especially significant for communities or countries that are already stricken by humanitarian crises of the food emergency variety, because one of the biggest difficulties in food emergencies is when because of the lack of local availability of food, the prices begin to escalate very quickly. And if that is happening in tandem to a global escalation in general of food prices, then you would have a very significant exacerbation of the humanitarian situation. And OCHA, who is based here, tracks food prices and actually fuel prices for a very similar reason quite closely to try and understand how these crises would evolve. So I think definitely food, agriculture, fisheries is one key area. Another one, logistics. I think we've been very lucky. One other, I'm also chairing the advisory board of the MSC Foundation. MSC is the world's largest global shipping and logistics group. It's also headquartered here in Geneva. The company happens to have also a port division, something like 80, 90 ports around the world. And including in the Bahamas, on Grand Bahama, it had a 50% stake in the Freeport port. Some of you will remember a couple of years ago, Hurricane Dorian hit Grand Bahama and almost completely destroyed, much like kind of what happened with Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu. It was a total destruction situation because of the storm surges, which were well above the level of the land. But for some, I mean, reason of pure luck, I don't know, maybe Maureen can tell us more what our chances are. But the port was unscathed, basically. So Freeport itself was somehow not damaged, even though the entire island was basically destroyed. And so we were able to requisition a ship and in a couple of days deliver like hundreds of containers of humanitarian aid through that port. But I mean, it could have so easily been the other way. And then you have situations like where whole coastal areas get flooded because, I mean, in Libya last year, there was a failure of a dam, which also destroyed a whole port and metropolitan area. If these things also start to happen, I mean, we've been a bit lucky that this hasn't happened so far, but I think that the risk element is in the system already. And we could see multiple disruptions to logistics if they happen to hit in key areas that would be extremely disruptive to global trade, would generate actually quite rapid inflationary risk, and carry other economic risks through the system. And obviously, if these things are happening at the same time as other global problems, like say a war in Ukraine, which also affects food supply or trade and logistics, then we have compounded risks. One other area I think is really significant would be in health. It's not so well known, and it's actually absent from a lot of national policies like what Anne was referring to. But for many countries in some of the most climate vulnerable regions, West Africa, Central Africa, South and Southeast Asia, exposure to extreme heat is the worst impact of climate change, both in terms of economic terms, because it directly affects productivity, the number of hours or days that you can work at the same level of efficiency. But it also affects human health, and can lead to quite significant disease prevalence and heat-related diseases, and as we know from Europe, the experience in heat waves to death, especially among the elderly. And it's particularly significant in many of these countries because of the large outdoor workforce, which cannot be immediately protected from heat. This is one of the also key factors that will increase, I think, when, and I'm not sure if we classify migration here in trade. Obviously, there's a huge kind of element of economic migration, and climate change and its effects on migration are usually embedded within economic migration to a certain extent. The erosion of like livelihood capabilities of certain regions that are heavily affected by things like heat. We will reach at a point pretty soon a situation where some communities in the hottest regions of the world will become essentially places where you cannot really live outdoors. And these are not tending to be places where people enjoy air conditioning. So it's something that is kind of on a scale of the level of populations, which kind of needs to be taken into account. But the health aspects also cut both ways. Some of you may have seen research by the Lancet, and in Europe at the moment, there are increasing cases of dengue. Dengue was essentially eradicated from Europe. The Lancet believes that climate change will reintroduce dengue as an endemic disease in Europe. Europe's health systems are not equipped at all to deal with tropical diseases that would circulate in the population. And I think that would bring us and maybe into the area of opportunities in trade. I think this could be a situation where Europe needs to benefit from the know-how of regions in the global south that live with vector-borne diseases as endemic health challenges. And I think one of the opportunities that, Anne mentioned technology. I think like perhaps the service sector is maybe one of the most interesting sectors for adaptation in terms of trade, because you need to have this exchange of know-how and information and understanding. A lot of what the Global Center on Adaptation does is basically works with the major development banks on their investment projects in Africa and other regions to make sure that they're climate informed and climate adapted, whether that's infrastructure and deploying nature-based solutions into new roading or other infrastructure projects or whatever it is. So far, we worked on something like $10 billion worth of investments in Africa. It's kind of something that needs to be done by everybody, everywhere. And having these plans is one thing, but implementing them, you need to look at, for instance, in China's strategy, they've updated the building codes for every region of China. To update those codes, you need to look at the scenarios that come from the WMO and apply them to very, very specific situations. And all of these know-how, expertise, and technology, I think if we get to an agenda, and if we look at the way climate and trade has operated so far, I think one of the biggest things that happened in the space was the CBAM that Europe put out in order to remove competition issues on the European carbon trading system for all imported goods. It's kind of a developing initiative, which is not without controversy. But I do wonder, are there really competition issues on adaptation? I mean, basically, climate change knows no borders, and everybody is kind of at risk. There's a type of global public good aspect. It would be hard to see, for instance, Africa withholding expertise on how to deal with tropical diseases to Europe, who's facing perhaps a resurgence of dengue after decades of it being eradicated. So I don't know if but I think in terms of an agenda, obviously we should look at what safeguards might need to be put in place for those who are most vulnerable. So particularly, I guess, in the food sector, looking at humanitarian emergencies that already exist, and can there be ways in which we can anticipate making sure that there are not really dire consequences if these shocks come about, and accelerating adaptation everywhere, because we're in basically an emergency situation. I mean, when you move from 1 to 1.5 degrees, and we were at about 1 degree about 5 years ago, and we're going to be at 1.5 degrees in another 5 years, roughly, you double the amount of extreme heat into the system. It's not like small changes. So we're living through what is going to be an extremely rapid and unprecedented change And so it's basically like an emergency situation. If the trade agenda could help to accelerate, proliferate adaptation, that would be a really good thing. Let us not forget that adaptation is like the poor cousin in this climate agenda. All the focus, all the finances have been largely on mitigation, like Anne mentioned, also in terms of trade. So there's a lot of ground that has to be covered. So I'll stop there. But thank you for the chance.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, I think, for highlighting some of the key sectors: fisheries, food, logistics, health, migration. I find interesting the point you made on the importance of trading services. That's something that we addressed. Know-how, technology, etc. So I think we've had four very interesting introductory remarks, which I think really cover a lot of ground. So let me open the floor for comments, reactions, questions. Yeah, I don't see anyone asking for the floor online.
Gets things started. One of the things, thank you for all the presentation. I think it's very interesting, and the presentation, NAPs and then the other tools. We're working, because my division, we also work on the biodiversity, we're working on climate, and we're working. So now countries have to do their biodiversity plan, they have to do their NDCs, they have to do their NAPs, they have to do their basically where are we going to be we have a competitive advantage in this new era. And my question is, because that's the question I keep asking my people, is how do we help countries? It's such a mess. And one of the major tools for adaptation is nature-based, right? So how do we use the common framework to help us in the NAP and in the NDCs? And so far, what I'm seeing is there's a very large gaps amongst them. So people that focus on the NAPs do not necessarily focus on the NDCs. Those that focus on the NDCs, we did a review of 60 NDCs. Developing countries are not using trade and investment measures to the level that they could. And this is mostly for mitigation, but we also look at adaptation. Even SIDS do not use all the ocean-related measures that they can use. So clearly, there is a lack of bringing the right ministries to the table. I can't remember who mentioned that. I think it was you, Judy. And at the same time, it's getting even more complex. And it's really important that the next NDCs by next year are 1.5 aligned. The Secretary General has asked us at the UN to ensure that we coordinate and stop fighting amongst the UN agencies so we can help to help the countries actually do that. But the question is, how do we do that? And bringing all of that knowledge, and I think it goes back to Maureen, what you were saying, is like, you need this high level, then you need to disaggregate it all the way so it's relevant for the local level, not only for the climate, but also, I think as Matthew was mentioning, disaggregating for the people that are most vulnerable. And it's just a major task. And we almost need to put all our models and our data together so we can, because the trade, and then the next point is, how do we account for the trade-offs and the co-benefits? Because that's co-benefits. But there's trade-offs. It's not true that they all go in the same direction. So again, and it's going to be specific to each countries and probably a region of countries, especially big countries like Pakistan and others. How do we really pull ourselves together to help those countries? It's more a question than that. And we can do our part, but I just feel this is way bigger than any one of us.
I have a couple of questions. Well, thank you very much for all the speakers. The questions I wanted to ask, and I'm not an expert, but I wanted to understand that the climatic zones, and I'm assuming is intuitively would be quite different from the political bound. So designing NDCs and the national adaptation plans based upon political boundaries, whereas the problem that we are trying to address, I'm just asking, would be probably cuts across. And my assumption is actually based upon what Pakistan and India face. We have a smog issue which starts in the months of October and continues until mid of Jan. Starts all the way from Pakistani Punjab all the way to Delhi. It's covered with smog and it's really bad during those 2-3 months. So I'm assuming that there is work done on that aspect. If there's any, I would like to hear about it. And the second question I wanted to ask was at a very, very basic level, it's human activity which is contributing to a number of these issues. Is there any entity, agency which is looking at the population growth and population explosion from an environmental perspective? Or the too controversial a subject? Thank you. There are 2 questions. Speakers can answer.
Let me see if I have remarks, and then I'll go back to the I see Brandon online, followed by the lady over there. Brandon.
Thank you, Christoph. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Great, thank you. I think this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for all the insights. The work at the Commonwealth Secretariat has also been focusing a lot on the issues that Joji had raised around the green squeeze. And I think, important issue there is to how you ensure a just transition and a fair allocation of the burden of change to some of these trade-related environmental measures. And I think that's something we need to think about because they really do impose onerous and burdensome compliance requirements on some of our smallest countries, SMEs, micro-producers, cooperatives. Another issue I think that's important for the conversation is the trade and finance and the trade and debt side to this. For example, how could we leverage trade to contribute to mobilizing climate finance, including climate adaptation finance? We know that if you look at what developing countries need, they need predictable, adequate, accessible climate finance to achieve their adaptation objectives, but they're really lacking access to that while they're paying the price for the impacts of climate change. I know the Africa Group, for example, has called for 50% of climate finance to go to adaptation objectives. So how do we leverage trade in that respect? And my final point, I think, is maybe just around this, trade climate debt spiral and trap that many of our small island developing states are vulnerable to, and we saw that in Antigua and Barbuda with some of the discussions at SIDS 4. Really, that increasingly with natural disasters that are driven by climate change, how they contribute to the debt burden and the unsustainability of that. Where one day you're a middle-income country, and the next day after a natural disaster you're a no-income country. And you don't have the capabilities, your infrastructure, your sectors, particularly services, have been diminished to grow that foreign exchange to build back better. So it's just this vicious trap and cycle, and how do we address that? Just some thoughts to throw into the mix. Thank you, Christoph.
Thanks, Brendan. Next on my list is...
My name is Carmen from Cape Verde. Yes. Thank you. I just was wondering, for countries like those who mostly depend on imports, food imports, how could they adapt? How could they mitigate the effects of all these crises, especially because we also depend on the rise of prices, and we completely depend on the food import. And how could us also adapt from this crisis? Thank you.
Thank you for making this.
Thank you, facilitator. I would like to share some experiences from Vanuatu. Thank you, facilitator. I would like to share some experience of the global setting. This is our topic on trade, climate change, and climate resilience development. I also wish to associate appreciation for Canadians' request to be part of this roundtable discussion. I looked on this agenda, which is part of our hearts, climate change and trade. But without taking too much of our time, I would like to go straight to reflecting some of the important provoking questions using Vanuatu examples. It's no secret that Vanuatu is one of the most vulnerable countries to natural disasters, such as tropical cyclones, earthquakes, and other climate-related phenomena. Data shows that the observed trend of which the number of tropical cyclones passing through 500 kilometers of Vanuatu declined by 28%. From 1971 to 1995 and 1995 to 2021. The intensity, the temperature, wind speed has increased by 15% over the same period. This has also led to an increase in severity from 45% to 57%. The rising impact of tropical cyclones has caused devastating effects on Vanuatu's economy. For instance, ECPAM in 2015 recorded a total value loss of 4.6 billion, approximately USD 390 million, equivalent to 64% of the nation's GDP. Similarly, Tropical Harold resulted in economic loss of 24 billion, USD 200 million. Just over a year, the back-to-back twin cyclones, Cyclone Kevin and Judy, caused widespread destructions, affecting 80% of the population and disturbing 26% of major road connectivity. Additionally, increasing sea level rise, ocean acidification, and rising temperatures pose significant threats to low-lying atolls and communities. 65% of the population living within 5 kilometers of the ocean. However, over the past years, the Vanuatu government has taken drastic measures in terms of policy directions and development priorities to combat the effects of climate change on our economic and development journey. One major initiative is the development of the climate change disaster risk reduction policy and implementation strategy. This policy is implementable from 2022 to 2030, while the implementation strategy covers 2022 to 2026, prioritizing short-term and long-term actions. This approach allows the harvesting of low-lying fruits and ensures feedback and interactions of possible climate recommendations. One might wonder why Vanuatu has a single policy for climate change and disaster risk reductions. As the Honorable Minister for Climate Change, Mr. Bule, stated, climate change and disaster risk reduction were treated at global, regional, and national level as separate policy issues, leading to duplications of structures and funding. The Vanuatu government and the disaster risk reduction policies are important advance in integrating is placing Vanuatu at the front of innovative approaches in the Pacific and internationally. Nevertheless, it is important to acknowledge that Vanuatu is far from achieving these recommendations, and we need support from development partners to combat climate-related changes. Just last month, my technical staff have engaged with the Vanuatu Climate Change Ministry in climate finance capacity building trainings and working discussions on how to streamline climate-related actions into various sectoral policies. We believe that these efforts attracts to a fruitful path for development of our country, particularly for us as seeds and other SBEs and LDCs. Thank you so for allowing this opportunity.
Thanks a lot for going through all the questions, answering them in a very organized and useful way. So really, thank you for sharing your presentation. And I think it touches on some of the points that have been raised, including the point by Chantaline on breaking the silos. But let me maybe, in the interest of time, go back to our discussion starters. We have a set of issues that have been raised. I think the point about silo and how do we have different parts of the government working together in an integrated approach. And the point you made about is there a mismatch between adaptations thought from a national political perspective versus a more kind of climate science-based approach. the point on population. I think we had some interesting remarks also by Brendan on leveraging trade or using trade to leverage climate finance, the issue of trade, climate, and debt, and then very specific questions about, I guess, how do we deal with the effect of climate change on essentially on prices and access and availability of food in important countries. So let me go back maybe to there's one. Let me take this last one, and then we'll go back to our speakers and move to the next session.
Good morning. My name is Loretta Heber-Jarde. I'm sorry I was late. I had another meeting this morning. But I wanted to pick up on two issues that were raised. And the first one was about population, which I think is interesting. And I can't say we're the organization. I'm from UNDR that focuses on population. But the point I would like to make is that I find that when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we're quite hazard-centric in our approach. We talk a lot about the increase in the intensity and the frequency of hazardous events due to climate change. But we perhaps don't focus enough on the vulnerability of populations and how that is increasing. And when we think about increased populations, we also need to think about what's increasing exposure to climatic events, such as rapid, unplanned urbanization, which we see as a major influence on how populations are suffering the impacts of climate change. And that there isn't enough talk, I think, or policies focused on vulnerability reduction as a key measure to addressing climate change impacts. And I think this is really quite important because if we become too focused only on the hazards itself, we lose sight of the fact that it's the interaction of communities with the hazards that lead to disastrous events and has economic impacts. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit later that addresses some of the other issues that were raised, but I did really wanted to bring up that link between the high levels of vulnerability and population. And the other point I wanted to make, which I thought was interesting, was about how one disastrous event can lead to long-term economic impacts. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's just an overall lack of investment in prevention. And we talk about, the hazards that are caused by climate change, but let's not forget that it was the volcanic eruption in Tonga and the ensuing tsunami that led to a reduction of 36% of its GDP. So there are other types of disastrous events as well that also merit attention that are not getting the type of investment, I would say, in prevention overall. So I just wanted to kind of throw those two reflections out to contribute to the conversations. And again, apologies for being late.
Oh, thank you. I think that the point on prevention and the idea of focus on vulnerability, and I guess it goes back also to the point made by Jody on structural economic transformation. I want to go back to our speakers, but I see that we have one more request for the floor online. So, Alex.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you just introduce yourself? I think you were there when we did the round of introduction.
Yes, of course. Apologies, I couldn't connect. My name is Alexander Stoyanov. I'm economist at the World Bank, based in DC. And I work as part of the Trade and Climate team, together with some other members. And I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. I couldn't make it today. I was in Bern. It was a bit far. I didn't know at what time we would start, but it's been very fruitful. And I just wanted to point a few things on the work we've been doing. So actually, we launched the Action on Climate and Trade together with the WTO and the World Economic Forum. And we have two pilot countries. One is Rwanda and one is Indonesia. I'm quite involved in the Indonesia one, where we do a lot of work on the interministerial coordination around the trade and climate agenda. And it's been very fruitful to hear from you and some of the insightful comments you've made, which are going to be of good help for our work. And we're also trying to see what are the actions they can take in terms of, trade and climate agenda, but also in the update of the NDCs, what can be done to include a little bit more on trade and the role of trade going forward in the objectives they're going to set. That's in a nutshell, but thank you very much for the invitation and for the fruitful conversation, and I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and great to have you with us. Let me go back to our speakers, and maybe I'll start with Maureen. You don't have to answer all the questions. But any part you want to react to?
Yeah, there were lots, so I will try. Thank you again, Christoph. So I'll try to respond to a few things. And I will start with the comment Judy made about climate information being very close and final resolution that is able to sort of inform policies at local scale. Now, we acknowledge that if you consider the global climate models, GCMs, then the data from the GCMs is quite close. But at WMO, we are promoting, or we are working on coordinated regional experiments, CORDEX project, that tries to downscale information from the global to regional, and then work with the different projects like the Regional Information for Society that works to integrate and co-produce this information with the local people, integrating in also the indigenous knowledge, which is quite useful to be able to inform adaptation measures at local scale. So if we look at it at the global scale, then of course there is that level of high uncertainty in climate information, which of course we as scientists acknowledge, and is a major challenge when it comes to sort of informing any policy measures, be it in the trade industry or any other sector. If I can move on to Ali's questions regarding the nature of transboundary risks when you are looking at climatic zones, and then the initiatives that are usually run at be it at national scale or at different scales. Yeah, we appreciate that climate risk might be confined to a certain region or a certain scale, but when you look at these initiatives or other initiatives, they're usually transboundary. And so from the climatic side of view, we are looking at it, or approaching it to look at multinational transboundary initiatives, whereby we can incorporate climate information because of the different climatic zones. One region will experience totally different climate or weather events compared to another region. But when you're looking at trade initiatives, they have to sort of like work together and then approach it with a multinational transboundary initiatives that incorporates both climate information and this transboundary information and overlay them for you to be able to come up with initiatives or be able to come up with policies that will be able to incorporate both the climatic risks and transboundary or other policies. To me, that is the best approach. If I could say that. In terms of anthropogenic forcings, at the World Climate Risk, at the WMO, we have the couple model intercomparison project, which looks at climate projection that informs the IPCC, and we are currently working on the assessment report 7 that takes into account all the different forcings, and we are also incorporating different anthropogenic forcings, including other forcings, into the model, and we are working on the modelization to be able to sort of look at the next assessment report. And in the structure that has been already released, that would include the 7th assessment report will follow. We are considering cities where there is a very huge challenge for population rise. And we are also looking at incorporating vulnerability and infrastructure to be able to sort of inform this assessment report, which will be coming out after the model benchmarking of the couple model intercomparison project in the next assessment report. If I may move on to the issue of overlaying climate risks and vulnerability, yes, that is an approach that is being embraced in the current co-production of climate information services at different levels, be it at regional or regional or local scale, because we have to overlay climate information vulnerability to be able to come up with the risk indices at different levels, because each region has different levels of vulnerability. And so you have to overlay climate information and vulnerability, not necessarily at the global or regional, because that will not give you much information, but this one has to be at a finer scale. And then you get different risk level that can inform proper initiatives or proper adaptation measures at local scale. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Matthew?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try and address just a couple of the points. Ambassador, you might be interested, there's a thing called the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is hosted at UNEP. They have a big office here. They're quite active on everything that relates to smog, short-term climate pollutants like soot. And they have a trust fund that finances projects in developing countries to address those concerns, just as somebody you might want to follow up with here. Very quickly on the 1.5 thing, because colleague Chantal mentioned about the next round of NDCs. For those familiar with the Paris Agreement, it's your commitment, national commitment under the Paris Agreement. We're wildly not aligned with 1.5 at the moment, and obviously, ideally, we should be. And it's not just the Paris Agreement; it's just in terms of all of the impacts and how much that will change if we reach or surpass. I think it's relevant just because possibly at this point, trade might be the only solution out of 1.5. Because basically, there was actually an IPCC report in 2018 on 1.5 specifically, and in that report, they gave a date range between 2030 and 2050 as when the world would reach 1.5. And then with the last assessment report of the IPCC, which is co-convened with WMO, the goalposts were moved by a decade. So now the IPCC says that we reach 1.5 between 2020 and 2040. And the best estimate for when we do it is 2030. So that is in 5 years' time. And obviously, because carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere for up to a century and beyond, basically, we more or less have to be pretty quickly close to carbon neutrality. And obviously, that is way beyond the ambition of practically any country. But the main issue, and this is how it relates to trade, is that this dirty word equity, dirty word because it's often been understood to mean like developing countries don't want to take climate action. That's why they talk about equity. But it's just a very practical aspect that certain countries have polluted since these international agreements all came into force a lot more than other countries. And certain countries have a lot more capability and wealth than other countries to also take emission cuts. And if you don't take into account that aspect, then you're assuming that all countries cut emissions at the same rate. And that's just very unlikely to happen without trade, and for there to be an acknowledgement that countries that have polluted a lot and have a lot of wealth need to take on higher ambition, and they need to deliver a component of that through international trade, basically. There's an Article 6 mechanism in the Paris Agreement that can deliver it, but it seems very unlikely that 1.5 would happen at this stage without a massive amount of essentially trade in carbon. Independent of that happening on adaptation finance, it's true that groups like the African group have called for a 50-50 split between international finance, between adaptation and mitigation, but actually there was an agreement at COP26 in Glasgow to double adaptation finance by 2025, from possibly around 20 billion to closer to 50 billion, which would almost achieve a 50-50 split, but it's really unclear if there's been any significant progress on that and if that target will be met, but it's a really important target. And then just to close, I think it's really fascinating, the question that was raised by, is it Cabo Verde? Because this presents a kind of a dilemma, I think, across some of the topics that we've been discussing. You want to promote free trade, but you end up being a net importer of food, which exposes you to the potential vagaries that will get a lot worse in the global food markets and the prices that you will be dealing with in terms of rapid fluctuations potentially that could really hit hard countries that are net food importers, as we have actually seen that happening already. And normally you would perhaps want to then, not be a net food importer. You'd want to, be essentially even exporting food, which would imply growing your food sector or growing your agricultural sector in order that you're going to be self-sufficient in a certain way. And we have different metrics of how you can measure structural change, which I think is honestly a really interesting adaptation strategy, because obviously in general, the agricultural sector is most vulnerable to climate change. And so if you can shrink that sector while growing your other sectors, it does make sense to have that as an adaptation strategy, except perhaps in this situation, where you need to think about how much vulnerability you would expose yourself to by being a food importer. And if you pursue that strategy, perhaps you have to adjust it in order that you avoid that risk. And also, perhaps because a colleague from UNDRR raised the question about unplanned urbanization. I mean, often this structural change is promoting urbanization. And in countries which have already rapid economic growth, like between 5 and up to 15% GDP growth per year in some of the countries where we see a lot of unplanned urbanization. And so if you're accelerating structural change, how does that relate to the urbanization, which is growing vulnerabilities? So I feel like it's a really interesting strategy that was proposed, but maybe needs to be thought through in specific cases to take into account all these different dynamics.
Thank you. I'll give the floor to Anne and Jody, and and then we move to the next session.
I'll be very brief. I just want to reinforce the real importance of trade in sort of meeting adaptation needs, because we already know that adaptation finance gap, so this came out in last year's adaptation gap report, is 10 to 18 times. So the gap is 10 to 18 times bigger than the needs, right? So the amount of international public finance in particular that's going to adaptation, they estimate is at the 20 billion a year. And latest modeling has looked at the fact that we're looking at more like $215 billion a year in needs to 2030. So the gap is huge. It's not going to be just met through international public finance, whether it's grants and loans. It's going to be, we're also going to be looking to fill those gaps and address those needs and priorities in different ways. And I think this is where it's important to look at the way we can really sort of use trade as a leverage for all of that. I think I just want to touch on the sort of alignment agenda I think that you raised, because there are all of these different these instruments and vehicles and agendas that sort of there's a huge messy Venn diagram, if you will. But institutionally speaking, the Venn diagrams are oftentimes they don't touch. But I think that there is an increasing recognition that for example, NDCs and NAPs can be mutually reinforcing instruments. You use the process of identifying and articulating your adaptation needs and make sure that they're reflected in your NDC. You make sure that your NDC gives a mandate to the country to undertake its adaptation planning process. And it's an institutional problem in many ways, right? Like it's how governments organize themselves, structure themselves, where these different instruments are being developed. And so, for us, it's also another example is looking at under the Biodiversity Convention, you've got the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans that, there's a lot of overlap with what's appearing in national adaptation plans. And so it's getting these parts, again, of government speaking to each other and I think insisting on these crosswalks being established, right? And making sure that you're reducing the burden on developing countries to sort of constantly redo assessments. There's so many assessments that we can really build on and have them reflected in these instruments. And we're seeing that right now, actually, in loss and damage as well. You know, there's discussion of having countries do sort of loss and damage assessments and then loss and damage plans. 80% of that overlaps with what they're already doing on adaptation, right? And we already saw during the climate negotiations, and I don't know if everybody would agree with me, but I feel like there's been a bit of a backsliding on adaptation in the global policy conversation, because I think so much, there was a bit of a zero sum, even though it didn't have to be, of people working on adaptation were sort of taken away and put into loss and damage because those overlaps are so big and real. And so I think it lost a bit of footing in the global policy conversation. And it's fantastic that we've got this loss and damage fund. We've got the Santiago network that's going to provide technical support on loss and damage. But now we risk setting up parallel structures. And so we need to sort of nip this in the bud, and we really need to send strong signals as sort of normative institutions and frameworks that, you know, we just don't want this duplication to take place. And so establishing crosswalks and guidance, making sure that the different institutions and the sort of governance bodies are working together and sort of coordinating when they meet, what they discuss in their agendas. I mean, this sounds ideal, but this is the only way we're going to get around, I think, the challenge that you identify. And then on transboundary issues, I would say that more and more countries recognize transboundary risks. Now, whether or not they're deliberately being addressed, because so much of adaptation is sort of place-based, but you see more and more countries identifying whether it's sort of transboundary ecosystem risks, whether it's through mobility, whether it's through financial services. They recognize, you know, value chains, they recognize that there's a lot of transboundary risk out there that needs to be deliberately addressed. And I think they're looking at existing transboundary bodies to be able to address them. So there's also a call for regional adaptation plans. Increasingly, there are regional adaptation initiatives that are addressing these transboundary risks, and looking at things like the Mekong River Basin Commission or the Lake Chad Commission, or, you know, the Nile Basin. Like, that's the obvious one for the transboundary water risks that exist in a particular region. Those are definitely important jumping off points. And I think that there are all sorts of regional initiatives that we don't have to create new institutions, I guess is what I'm saying. They can sort of be the locus for developing transboundary approaches to addressing to developing solutions to these risks.
Thank you. And I think we'll come back to many of these issues in the next session, which is really about cooperation. Last but not least, Jody.
Yeah, just very briefly, because I know everyone wants to move on to the next session, but I think this was precisely why we took this angle of structural economic transformation, because it then means that you're bringing together not just the climate people, trade people, but also Ministry of Finance, people involved with planning, you know, to try to bring this all together. And, you know, it's still work in progress. We know that there are lots of other institutions all trying to do this, like break down the silos. Basically, and you know, we are still working with quite dated models and approaches. I'm just thinking about the transmission of pricing. I mean, the IMF kind of has started to recognize these spillover effects and has, you know, sought to update its models and approaches, but it's also been told to kind of get back and stay within its remit as well. So we are kind of working within this quite a tricky space at the moment. There's a great initiative called Adaptation Without Borders. Some of my colleagues at ODI are working on this, and they're working on precisely these issues of you know, the kind of spillover effects and how these, you can't just have a national focused approach. You need to kind of open this out and to consider how vulnerabilities are passed on and so on. And then just a final point, of course, I'm here at least for the Aid for Trade Review, about kind of mainstreaming trade, and I understand that that kind of focus is also intended to draw attention to these issues around climate change as well. So, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jody. A really fascinating discussion. We have to move to our next session. So I'm glad to now give the floor to who's going to share our next session. But, thanks a lot to all our speakers, discussion starters, and I look forward to a second session.
So Thank you, everyone. Really delighted to be moving us now to the second session this morning. So as Christoph said at the beginning of our discussion, one of the reasons we really wanted to have this roundtable today was to put a spotlight on issues around adaptation, vulnerability, climate resilient development, and also to some extent issues of loss as well, recognizing that the climate crisis is having direct impacts already on many countries and their economies. The reason we wanted to do that is because the climate and trade discussion narrative at the global level is very much on decarbonization and mitigation, for good reason. This is a vital agenda for many of the most vulnerable countries as well, that these issues are addressed. So we wanted to make sure we put some more emphasis on these other dimensions of the climate crisis. So I'm really happy to be in the second session where what I think we've done so far is a little bit of a diagnosis of some of the trade intersections, the issues at hand, but really look here on what could be done to foster more cooperation on these topics in the multilateral trading system. It could be bilaterally, it could be through different kinds of trade partnerships, linkages, as I think Brendan mentioned earlier, between issues of trade, finance, and debt, for example. I was just looking through the participants list, and I see what's exciting is that we have representatives here from a number of the international organizations that play different parts in this. So we have WMO, UNCTAD, the World Bank, Formal Secretariat, colleagues from the WTO, from the Aid for Trade, from DRR, and also organizations like ISD who've been doing huge amount of adaptation, IED, and others. So I feel like we have a critical mass of some of the players here who have the capacity to sort of elevate this adaptation and resilience side. But to begin this discussion, what I wanted to do is invite several representative countries who are at the front line of the climate crisis to tell us a little bit about what they view as some of the priorities. In a way that we frame the discussion, and at TESS, we like to emphasize this issue of climate resilient development. It's there in the UN discourse. And I think for us, it's not just a discussion around trade and climate, but trade and climate in the context of countries' quest for sustainable development and for development, and in this instance, climate resilient development. So we think that's a really important theme to bring through, to connect it back to these underlying concerns that countries have around the welfare and prosperity of their populations as well. So with that, I'm pleased to turn, we have 5 speakers this morning, and each will just take 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll have time for an open discussion. So I will introduce them all first, and then I'll turn. So first we have Jimmy Rantes, who's the Director General of the Ministry of Trade and Commerce in Vanuatu. Then we'll have Ambassador Hussain, who's the permanent representative of Pakistan to the WTO. And then I'm delighted that we're also joined by Ambassador Head, who is the permanent representative of Cameroon to the United Nations office here in Geneva. So I'm really happy to also have some regional diversity, different types of countries who face different issues here. Then we'll have Loretta, who spoke earlier, who's the Chief of the Risk, Knowledge, Monitoring and Capacity Development branch at the UN Disaster Risk Reduction. We call it the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Organization, or it's a
UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction.
Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. Super. And then lastly, we're going to have Ratnika Adhikari, who's the Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework. And just to note that one of the particular questions I've asked our panelists to address is also how can we promote more attention and cooperation on these issues in the multilateral setting, including in the context of Aid for Trade and the Enhanced Integrated Framework. And I say this because we had the big Aid for Trade Global Review this week. There's an opportunity also to highlight some of these issues in that context. So without further ado, I turn firstly to Mr. Rantes, please.
Thank you, Caroline, facilitator. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the discussion. As a guest speaker on this distinguished ambassadors, fellow UN colleagues and experts in the field of trade and environment, and of the students of the Geneva Climate Institute. This important discussion on trade, climate change, climate adaptation, and climate resilience development is crucial for our collective future. I also wish to extend my nation's gratitude to Caroline and her team here at TESS for the in its responsibility as the Secretary to the Coalition for Trade Ministers on Climate. This is certainly not an easy undertaking, as your team's dedication to the global effort. Regarding enhanced international cooperation on trade in support of adaptation, we believe trade can play a significant role in helping countries, especially those vulnerable to climate change, build resilience, and adapt to changing climate. As previously stated, Vanuatu's vulnerability position in the UN in terms of climate change necessity support through shared knowledge and experience, financial support and investment, building resilient supply chains, and promoting sustainable development goals. These are some of the co-interventions we would like to explore through WTO, UN, and international cooperation. In terms of shared knowledge and experience, Vanuatu benefits from the well of traditional knowledge. Communities relying on ancestral wisdoms to adapt to environmental changes and weather fluctuations. Recognizing the critical role traditional knowledge plays in resilience is paramount for development of small island nations such as Vanuatu cannot be emphasized enough. Secondly, the financial and investment support for building resilience, development in developing countries is crucial. For seeds, SPs, and LTCs, we have contributed significantly less to carbon footprints. It is only fair for developing countries to increase their support as a form of compensation for damage and in line with the polluter-based principle. What better ways than such informal discussion like this would unify our collective voices, collaborative efforts through Triangular and South-South cooperation. In terms of the South-South cooperation efforts, the Pacific Island country leaders meeting in October 2030 endorsed in principle the drafting of a regional sustainable trade strategy for the Pacific. The Pacific needs to take steps now to integrate sustainable development policies with a strategy for cleaner environment and greater resilience. As part of this transition, a coherent regional sustainable trade strategy will soon be developed, setting out policy principles, strategy elements, targets, and policy instruments. This strategy will acknowledge the benefits and risks of trade for the environment and human life, takes place in the connected system. These sections in the important regional strategy will include topics to our roundtable discussions such as enhanced focus on resilience, continuing mainstreaming of sustainable development goals into trade, recycling, and the circular economy, national and regional initiatives and policies for transition to environmentally friendly production and products, full use of multilateral fora and negotiations defensively and to promote sustainable trade, and aid for trade strategy to support sustainable transition. However, we recognize the limited capacity of resources we have, seeds, SPEs, and LDCs. Thus, we urge support for our partners as we work towards a resilient domestic and regional nations. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dantes. A really comprehensive look at some of the issues that Vanuatu is facing and some very concrete proposals for what needs to be done to support ways forward. So I'm going to move directly now to Ambassador Hussain to give us perspective from Pakistan.
Thank you very much. Let me make a few points. I will not go into details about the climate vulnerability of Pakistan. I think a lot of you already know. I hear a lot of discussion about what trade is the key to environment and the trade nexus. But when we look at what's happening, so if you look at COP28, we had a trade day. There was a trade house nestled somewhere in a very distant corner. And then we had the ministerial conference in February in the same country. And when you look at the outcome document, the word environment does not appear. You can search for it. There's a paragraph 21, which was actually negotiated by the mission of Pakistan with other members. It was diluted a lot by other members. And it was precisely not just to address the disasters caused by natural hazards, but also that sudden floods, volcanic eruptions, earthquake, pandemic, food security challenge. And the idea is for membership to have a discussion to come up with a framework, so at least those short-term challenges can be addressed through the WTO rulebook by providing some kind of special and differential treatment on a short-term basis, not on a long-term basis. And there could be multiple solutions around that. So as far as the WTO is concerned and what's happening in UNFCCC, I think one thing that needs to happen is the trade minister should be going to the UNFCCC and the climate minister should be coming to the ministerial conference in the WTO. Because that disconnect is there, and really what would really move the system, what really is the liquidity, and hence you need the finance ministers at both places. That's first. The second point I would like to make is we know what's causing it. We know what has happened in the past. The reason that the developing countries are asking for polluters pay, and there should be a common but differentiated responsibility, is because developing countries are not responsible for the mess we are in right now. So hence those who have caused the problem need to pay disproportionately more. I'm not saying that developing countries do not need to contribute, but those who have done it should pay more. But I see your note, and IPC says limited funding resources, almost 1/10 of what's really required. I think on this forum, previous discussion, I'm saying that we need to engage private sector, but the private sector will come in if their risk-adjusted returns make sense for them to invest in climate. And in order to do that, rather than providing 10x to cover what the total amount is required, maybe developed countries should start thinking about setting up the risk guarantee funds. And actually, you can leverage them by a factor of 10 to meet up that gap. That could be one potential way where they don't have to put up all the funding that's required, which I know there's a lot of reluctance to do that and not likely to happen. And the second part is we can come up with brilliant plans. Chantal can prepare the best NDC in the world for us, but unless we are able to implement it, it won't mean a lot. For that, we need those resources, which are financial resources. We need human resources or skill. We need organizational resources, but organizational skills are organizational level. And I think those three areas we need to work on together, and there should be a partnership. Unfortunately, at WTO, we are very commercial, right? We think about subsidies and tariffs. So while we are talking about how trade can contribute, there are barriers to transfer of technology, which are environmentally sound technologies. Countries are putting up tariffs on environmental goods. If I were to just take my hat on the environment, you see tariffs on EVs, solar, lithium-ion batteries. There's a trade war going on. It's going to get worse in WTO. So it would be tricky and challenging, but I think probably the environmental conversation in WTO won't help as much as the conversation of trade in UNFCCC. And I think that may be one way to kickstart the discussion. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Really good thought-provoking comments. I mean, the challenge, I was thinking your point on engaging trade ministers more in the climate arena and climate ministers more in the trade arena, and linking that with the finance. So going back to Anne's point that we can make the intellectual connections. The challenge is how to also at the national level to encourage governments to do that. I mean, even, we're as the Secretariat of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate really doing a lot of work to encourage trade ministers to go to the UNFCCC. But then there are just resource constraints. They send their ag minister and their climate minister and their foreign minister. How many ministers do they send? How do they coordinate internally? But I think your point is this is one of the hugest crises that Atlantic is facing. And so maybe we need to think of ways, but it will only take a few. I think if we have some champions of doing that, then it will create the the momentum for others to come and to make those conversations happen. But with that, I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Ed, please, to give us your perspective from Cameroon.
Thank you, Madam Caroline. And first of all, I want to sincerely thank you and your staff for this beautiful and important initiative, which gives us the opportunity to explore in depth main trends and developments in policies and trade cooperation with a view of leveraging them to support multilateral cooperation and adaptation to climate change and climate resilient development. As you all know, ladies and gentlemen, most of our states, which are most often victims of the harmful effect of climate change, remain concerned by the current trends towards the generalization of unilateral and protectionist measures aimed at creating competitive disadvantages for limit foreign competition and the development of international trade. I take an example. Since the adoption by the European Parliament in April 2023 of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism Directive, CBAM, the proposed revision of the greenhouse gas emission trading system, as well as the entry into force of the EU regulation on deforestation field products on June 29, 2023, the prospect of a desired negotiation of certain international trade agreements within WTO could further complicate the trade and development policy of many countries, including mine, which have an economy essentially based on the trade of agricultural and forestry products, therefore largely on the primary sector. These new environmental mechanisms do not tend to place human beings at the center of adaptation concern in the face of challenges imposed by climate change, but rather tend to want to create imbalances within economies of developing countries by creating technical barriers to trade, further limiting the equitable access of developing countries to the market or industrialized countries. In terms of priority, it will be desire for certain political measures in the climate and environmental field to take into account existing commitments in order to preserve the fairness of international trade rules or agreements. It should also be noted that the African continent, which includes my country, Cameroon, contributes to less than 5% to the global emission of the greenhouse gases, just as it has the second largest forest massive of the global, the Congo Basin. Unfortunately, Africa, which is the region of the world trade pollute the planet the least, receives an incongruous portion, even very little and insignificant, of the green financing, green trade, or compensatory resources for damage linked to the finance mechanism of the carbon market. Our country more than need innovate financing to meet adaptive needs to finance development and ecological transition in our country, whose contribution to global warming remains insignificant. In view of the above, the issue of forest conservation and the promotion of economic and commercial development should remain at the heart of multilateral discussion in all existing cooperation or partnership programs facing adaptation to climate change. Regarding the question of this roundtable on the voice to follow or on the orientation to follow and making into account of the legitimate concern of developing countries, it is more than important in the perspective of the 14th Ministerial Conference, which my country is going to host in 2026, so that the multilateral discussion underway within WTO Trade and Environmental Committee can respect or, if necessary, supplement the commitments made by states in other fora on environmental protection and resilience in the face of climate change. It is more than necessary that policy and the related global response can take into account the industrialization potential of developing countries in all its forms, while supporting as much as possible the energy transition of the African continent towards an increase in energy production, for example, agricultural goods services with low carbon emission. It is also important that the international trade rules can also facilitate and promote the transfer of technology, including environmentally friendly technologies, spatially and differential treatment, as well as my colleague said, as well as the integration of the principle of common but differential responsibility. Finally, to conclude, referring to the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Declaration, as he said, on the contribution that the multilateral trading system can make to meeting environmental challenges, I would like to reiterate here the call to bilateral and multilateral partner countries. One, the need not to impose unilateral environmental measures linked to trade. Second, to encourage increasing transparency of environmental measures linked to the international trade based on equity and inclusion. To promote, in various WTO bodies or international forums a coherent and open approach in the conduct of multilateral discussion based on consensus in the examination of issues related to trade, climate change, and environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Just busy taking notes on all of the specific recommendations that you made. So I'm going to thank you again very much for those interventions. I'm going to turn directly now to our next speaker, who is Loretta Heber-Jurdet from the DR.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have to say we're a small organization, part of the UN Secretariat, and we're not often invited to discussions on trade. But I think it's some, a recognition now that the disaster impacts that we deal with are having an impact throughout the entire system. And trade is obviously one of them. So maybe just a few reflections from my side. It's clear that the scale and the intensity and the frequency of climate-related disaster events is increasing. From our work with countries, we know that around 80 to 90% of their disaster events right now are considered to be extreme weather linked to climate. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the hazard. What we actually are seeing is that countries that have high levels of exposure, low capacity, and high levels of vulnerability are obviously the least able to deal with the climate impacts. Globally, though, what we note is that we are creating new risk faster than we are able to manage the risk. And that means our development practices are actually creating disaster risks that are outpacing our investment in preventative measures to address the disaster risk. We note that, we have seen many times the impact of disasters, for example, on supply chains. And I think back to Thailand's floods in 2011, which had a tremendous impact on supply chains for the automobile industry and they were producing chips, microchips. So we've known for quite some time that disasters can have an important impact on supply chains. And yet I would say there's still been quite a significant disconnect, especially at the country level, between those that are responsible for disaster risk reduction, those that are responsible for climate change adaptation, as we heard earlier, and those who are responsible for developing trade and finance policies. I'll come back to that, what we're trying to do to address this in a moment. But just to give you some of the statistics that I thought could be interesting, we did note that according to some research carried out by Oxford University, more than $122 billion of economic activity, that's 81 billion in maritime international trade, is at risk from the impact of climate change events just on ports alone. Our own organization tracks all of the economic impacts of disasters, and we've just about 2 weeks ago passed the 1 trillion mark since 2015. And these are direct economic impacts from climate change since the launch of the Sendai framework, which is the framework that guides disaster risk reduction globally. We know this is a huge underestimation because these are official statistics that we received, but obviously, what we note is through better investment in preparedness and even early warning systems, which is still really limited in many countries, we do see a decrease in mortality and the number of people affected by disasters, but a significant increase in economic losses. And so this is something that is of great concern because obviously this has an impact on the well-being of countries. And I might just also add that in many of the countries, what we understand by climatic impacts are high-frequency, low-intensity events. So these are not mega disasters, although we have obviously seen these in places like Pakistan with the flooding. These are events that are cumulative at the local level over time, extreme weather, and they have an impact on the economic well-being at a local level, at a community level, through roads closures, through school closures, through various impacts from these rather what we consider extreme weather events that don't claim headlines, but cumulatively over time erode the socioeconomic well-being at communities, especially in the most highly affected countries. So what are some of the ways that we are trying to address this? Now, it was already noted that adaptation finance needs are 18 times greater than what we currently see flowing. I might just add that disaster prevention is around 4% only of overall disaster expenditure. That means that 96% of funding is spent after the disaster occurs, including emergency response, reconstruction, relief, rehabilitation. And we have found that the lack of investment in disaster prevention is really exacerbating the impacts once the disaster occurs, obviously. I mean, we can talk about resilient infrastructure, for example, the lack of risk assessments that go into a new infrastructure, meaning that the new infrastructure that's being invested in is not being built to withstand future climatic impacts. So again, the creation of new risks. We recently held a midterm review of the Sendai framework, and we found that obviously finance is one of the greatest impediments for countries to invest in risk reduction measures. But even in countries where finance shouldn't be a problem, it's not a priority. It has never been a priority, really, because I think there's a sense why invest in something that may not occur. This, I think, is changing somewhat because we are seeing countries even like Germany having very high impacts from flooding, including unprecedented levels of mortality. So unfortunately, to some degree, climate change is driving up greater recognition of the need for investment, even though it's not quite there where it needs to be, obviously. So just some of the options and some of the work that we're trying to do to help countries. The first is we believe there needs to be improved data and knowledge on the impacts of the losses and damages. We have had, for many years, a loss and damage tracking system that is in more than 100 countries worldwide that helps countries understand the impact of climate change and to use this data in order to drive policies and programming. Now, unfortunately, even in countries that are tracking their losses and damages, what we see is that the data is not being used to really drive decision-making. Not only by the disaster risk management agencies, but other ministries and sectors that would benefit from a better understanding of the losses and damages. So we are rolling out, along with the World Meteorological Organization and the UNDP, a new tracking system for countries, but also it goes beyond looking at primary impacts. We're also looking at the cascading impacts of disasters. So that means not only understanding the direct impacts, but also non-economic losses and losses from slow onset events, which of course has tremendous impact in countries. We also are promoting something we call comprehensive risk management. It's already been mentioned here. This alignment between various frameworks is a real challenge for countries. It's not just between the NAPs and the NDCs, it's the disaster risk management strategies as well. It's the sustainable development goals that need to be made climate and disaster risk informed. It's the policies and regulatory frameworks as well that bring together climate change, disaster risk reduction, and trade objectives. They could be better combined. They're currently not. We have been doing work bringing together planning ministries, finance ministries, environment ministries, and disaster risk management agencies. And sometimes it's the first time that they have actually met to look at how could the policies be made more coherent. Integrated national financing frameworks, for example, how are they being used in a more effective way? and to look at risks across all of the various sectors linked to climate and other types of disasters. And I also think that many of the agencies in the UN system are starting to look towards the post-2030 agenda. And this is an opportunity for us to come together and look at how can we promote greater alignment between these different agendas so that it's not such a challenge at the national level to come up with what is essentially climate-sensitive, risk-informed development pathways, which takes into account all of the different variables, including the finance and trade elements. Maybe my final words, I'd like to go back to the point that I thought was quite interesting about how loss and damage, 80% is adaptation. Well, 80% of adaptation is disaster risk reduction. So we have gotten ourselves into a situation where we are creating new mechanisms. Loss and damage is obviously the latest one. UNDRR is the co-host of the Santiago Network, which we have set up now with UNOPS, and we've just established the advisory board. Headquarters will be here in Geneva. But what's interesting is indeed the types of requests that we are seeing are for things like loss and damage assessments. It is for creating new policies. And I think it's sometimes with the understanding that there's new money coming with this. And that's not my understanding necessarily. There's the loss and damage fund, but ultimately, whether it's taken from disaster risk reduction, adaptation, or loss and damage, the pot is limited. And so, you know, by creating new structures and new systems, we do run the risk of greater fragmentation. And I think it's very important that we work together to ensure that this doesn't happen. The other thing maybe about the Santiago Network, it would be great to see requests from countries, but not from the usual suspects, not from the disaster risk management agencies only, but also from planning ministries, the finance ministries, and others that could be seeking technical support for developing policies, regulatory frameworks, and others that could address these issues of trade, for example. And also, really to look at how the private sector both can be a provider of technical support, but can also request technical support through these new mechanisms. So you have a much more holistic approach to managing climate risk, bringing in multiple sectors and really drawing on the, I would say, the expertise of multiple sectors and different types of bodies. We call them OBNEs, but essentially it's the technical expertise that sits globally that can be brought to the forefront to help countries on the front line of the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Loretta, and thank you also for reviewing some of the work that you're doing. It's interesting because it seems quite well with what Ambassador Hussein was saying about, you know, this emphasis. There is an interest in work on adaptation and resilience, but also on what to do in the face of disasters of a range of different kinds. So we have the different pieces of this puzzle. Just before I turn to Ratnikar, I wanted just by way of context, just before you speak, to note that this morning in several of the presentations, there was an emphasis, I think in the words of Jody, on this idea of a green squeeze, that countries, and this is also reflected in the comments of Ambassador, countries face the challenge of adapting and responding to climate risks and impacts and vulnerabilities that may be hitting their productive sectors and sectors that they rely upon for trade, for the welfare of their populations. At the same time, they have to adapt to a changing regulatory environment on climate. And that this together, it's these two things together that affect their capacity to pursue the diversification strategies and economic transformation that they want to pursue. So I just wanted to throw that in before you spoke, just to link between the two, because I think the pieces of the conversation are joining together. Over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline, for providing this opportunity. And thank you, Jody, already for bringing the perspective of aid for trade and other dimensions also. And thank you, Ambassador. And Ambassador Sarfraz, he has left, but he made a very good point. So I would like to come back to the point that he made earlier. So I would like to focus on aid for trade, basically, and this is what we do. We are EIF. As EIF, what we do, enhance integrated framework. What we do is to provide trade capacity building support to LDCs. And given the fact that in the second phase of the program, which started in 2016, we have included environment gender and poverty as cross-cutting issues. So therefore, we have looked at environmental issues, particularly climate change, constructively and positively to see how they could be integrated in the trade policy making process, as well as in the design of productive or institutional capacity project we support on the ground. So I would like to really focus on some of the concrete examples emerging from countries, and both positive as well as negative. Let me start by, I have 5 points, so in 5 minutes, hopefully I'll be able to conclude those. The first one relates to analytical work. So when we talk about the analytical work, we have a toolkit called Diagnostic Trade Integration Study that we do in all these countries. We conducted 55 such DTISs so far. And these DTISs are updated on a regular basis to take into account some of the emerging priorities. And as a result of which, for example, Zambia, which concluded its DTIS process in 2022 recently, has included a separate chapter on climate change, and not only looking at the mitigation aspect, but also adaptation and resilience aspect. The other point that is important from the perspective of DTIS is that the DTIS are now ISs are now increasingly looking at the national adaptation plans of countries to see how some of the elements in the national adaptation plan, such as the one that Loretta mentioned, the supply chain resilience and other, can be integrated into the design of the trade policy. So therefore, what we've also done is to integrate these elements. We have started a review process of the DTIS, and then the title of the document will be released this year. It's called Greening the DTIS, where the elements of various climate-related elements or other environment elements will also feature there. And we have highlighted some of the good practices, and based on that, we would be in a position to better integrate these issues in the analytical framework. Second point, relating to coordination, and this is something that everywhere I go to these kind of discussions, I find this, siloed mentality, siloed sort of work culture, the lack of coordination. There are several examples of that comes along. But what is required for coordination is, I think, policy advocacy and dialogue. And this is what we are trying to facilitate. In the case of Gambia, what we did was to bring the trade ministry, and this is an example that I have discussed earlier also. So this is where we actually brought the trade ministry and environment ministry together to work in a kind of coordinated manner in order to sort of prepare their agenda for mobilization of climate finance. And they have worked extremely close in close collaboration. And this is where we had the role of a champion, actually. And this is something that you highlighted. It's very, very important. So we have the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Commerce, who is the champion. And the ambassador here, Ambassador Ka, many of you know, these are champions in Gambia. So they actually follow through to make sure that these ideas are sustainably incorporated and acted upon. So that's also important. And in some cases, what happens is that if you want to facilitate these processes, it's not going to be sufficient to just engage with these two ministries. It would be important to reach out to the government officials or the high-level officials who have cross-cutting responsibilities, such as planning ministry, such as the Prime Minister's office or President's office, who have the convening power and bring all the stakeholders together. And that would be super helpful. And we've done it in the case of Cambodia. Then the third one is mainstreaming. And mainstreaming actually comes from the analytical work, but at the same time, it is important to understand that many countries have mainstream trade in their national development plan, and they have now mainstream climate change also in their national development. And we were happy to support Gambia to undertake this mainstreaming exercise of both climate dimension as well as trade dimension in what is known as Green Recovery Focused National Development Plan they rolled out in 2022. This was after COVID, and then we provided support to them. And currently, Cambodia is working together with us in order to include the climate dimension in the trade policy for 2030 that they are right now preparing. So there we are also engaging other colleagues from the WTO and the Asian Development Bank and a few other institutions to sort of bring everything together. The fourth point relates to finance, and this is extremely important. Ambassador of Pakistan mentioned de-risking, which is important for mobilizing resources. But what we've tried to do in a number of countries is to support their investment in climate reform in order to provide the necessary regulatory tool that would include the dimension of environment and climate and environmental assessment and whatnot, in order to make sure that the government, the environment protection agencies are sufficiently sensitized to bring that dimension as well in the area of investment climate. The other important aspect is leveraging, and I want to provide a real-life example of leveraging that we've done in Vanuatu. DG Rantes is here, so you would probably be in a position to elaborate further. Back in 2000, and this is not relating, and this is something really not relating to private sector resource mobilization, but development partner resource mobilization that we did back in 2015. So what we did was, when the cyclone pump destroyed the seafront of Vanuatu, we provided Vanuatu with 3.1 million with the expectation that the government will be able to mobilize additional resources. And they were indeed able to mobilize additional 15.8 million from the government of New Zealand for the construction of the seafront, and which is actually now a major landmark in the city of Port Vila to attract tourists. So that's one example. And finally, in relation to finance, we've also supported development of bankable projects in a few countries. And Gambia, again, stands out as a great example where we provided support to develop a bankable project for their green industrial park. And then once they have now developed the bankable project, they have reached out to African Development Bank to be the accredited entity to submit the proposal to Green Climate Fund. And the final point is the improved practices. So we've talked about policy, we talked about coordination and everything, but then they have to be applied in practice. Ambassador of Pakistan also mentioned that what we've done in Lesotho is to provide farmers with greenhouses in order to plant. It's a kind of project that we implemented together with ITC, and they are now sort of planting different kinds of vegetable, all weather. Despite all the challenges that they face because of harsh winter and all of that. So that's one adaptation practice that we have we supported in Lesotho. Another is Rwanda has, with our support, prepared e-waste policy, and currently they have been recycling, reusing, and exporting e-waste, including the waste from tablets and computers and phones. As a result of which, they are now exporting some of these materials they are able to reuse to other countries such as UAE, and they have created 400 jobs thanks to the e-waste facility they have created through our support. I want to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think also for the very specific updates on the work that you're doing. One quick question I had: are the DTIS, are they publicly available, or they're only available to the member states?
The DTIS is publicly available on our website. Okay,
it sounds like they would have a lot of very useful information for many in this room. So I'm now going to open the floor for discussions. We have about 40 minutes. I remind those online that please do put up your hands if you want to ask questions or engage in the discussion. What we're really trying to do in this discussion now is to think, I think, quite concretely about what are some pathways forward around cooperation initiatives that could be connected better or taken forward in this space. Many of you I know are working on different aspects of these issues already. But it would be useful to think about ways forward. We've heard the fact that there are many different actors. We're always hearing this word coherence and coordination. The challenge is always, yep, every meeting ends with that, more coherence, more coordination. But I liked Radnika's point in this regard that sometimes it seems hopelessly complicated. But sometimes it's not that complicated if you have even just a couple of champions in a country. And I always think in international relations, we underestimate the role of individuals to catalyze processes within governments and to oversee them and keep to push them forward. So that's something, I guess, a when you said that, I felt a little more hopeful than leaving the meeting with a recommendation for more coordination and coherence, because obviously it's tricky. And part of it, I think, is different actors taking responsibility for making those links. Whether you're in the trade ministry, the disaster reduction unit, or the climate unit, whatever it is, you're taking responsibility for trying to connect the dots. It may not be as hard as we think. One thing I did want to mention, which I think is a subtext here, is a lot of the climate regime, both in terms of the NDCs and the NAPs, is very much focused on national plans. And today, several of you have highlighted the transboundary dimensions. I think when we talk about trade, of course, we're talking about international supply chains. There's another side to your trade equation, whether it's those you're importing food from, as Cabo Verde said, or those that you're trying to export products to, or so on. And the challenge I feel with the climate regime is it encourages countries to think nationally. What are the trade things you're going to put in your national NDC? Whereas what we want to think about, what do you need in terms of partnerships with your trading partners, or what kind of relationships or things need to be facilitated, which would encourage you to look beyond your borders and signal to others what you would need for them in order to be able to meet your goals or your national action plans. Maybe that's growing, but I don't see that as being a core thrust. And maybe that's something that the trade community can bring, is to highlight this interconnected aspect. But that's just some initial thoughts to spur discussion, but really open to all of you. And I encourage those who are in the first panel to help us connect back to this sort of way forward discussion. Floor is open. Jody, thank you.
Excellent. So thank you so much for your intervention. I'm just thinking ahead to the next WTO ministerial. I see Cameroon, I understand, is hosting. I was just, you've made some very strong points there about the rise of unilateral green trade measures. And if I remember rightly, and Caroline will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but just ahead of the last ministerial conference, there was a push by the African group to kind of raise the profile of climate-related trade policies. And so I was just wondering, just in terms of next step, as we look ahead to the next ministerial conference, how optimistic are you that some of these issues will gain greater traction across members? And perhaps, Caroline, you also know more about this as well, given the work that you're doing supporting the trade.
Thank you for your question, which is very, very important, because this issue for us is a dilemma. On the other hand, we have to conserve as I said, the nature is very important for us, and we are aligned with the general policy over the world about the conservation of the nature. But on the other hand, we have to face a lot of challenges, supporting budgets, living of standard of the people. And that's what this issue comes. And as you said, our idea as African group, our idea also so many African countries, that we need to find an equilibrium, balances between the conservation of the nature and the trade policy. That's why we said I focus my intervention mainly on this CBAN measure, for example. This is not only the one, that we should develop a kind of transparency measures. Our economies are mainly focused on the production of raw materials. So the less of industrial policy is very low. The policy industry is very low. So we need to avoid, if we are talking about global market, we are talking about globalization, we are talking about one world, we need to avoid unilateral measures. It is very, very important. And a lot of transparency, because sometimes we are surprised that there is a new measure and then we have to adapt. We don't have any alternative possibility to develop our economy. So that's why, for example, as you said, during MC14, the question of trade and environmental, and mainly the trade agriculture, those are the questions that are very important. We hope that during MC14, which will be hosted in Cameroon, some of these issues are going to be addressed in a good way. The discussion are following in WTO. We hope that we are going to find solutions. I don't know if I answer your question, but I think for us it's a very, very important one.
Thank you, Excellency. Any other comments from Taline, please?
Sorry, taking the floor again, but thank you so much, Excellencies, for this presentation. Just to follow up also on what I said earlier, because you mentioned on top of it, there's the VNR, the voluntary national unions. But it brings because the coherence between the SDGs and this transition, right? And so it's often forgotten, and that means that there's a perception by a lot of our member states that we're doing green at the expense of people. And that can happen because then we won't have the policies needed for the transitions. So what we did, one thing that we're doing right now, and I would love to see who else can work with us on this is, and we've submitted this to Azerbaijan for the COP29, it's called BICFIT. It's the Baku Initiative on Climate Finance, Investment and Trade. First is bring back investment and trade together because they tend to be separate. And second, it's to bring finance and trade and investment. And so one of the things that we're thinking of, Caroline, we haven't talked about that, but is to bring, we have the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate, but we need to bring them with the Coalition of Finance Ministers. So on that, we're working now on modeling, basically based on the network, the central bank, the network of central bank and regulators on green finance. So they did these scenarios for net zero. And now we're using the models. And then with McKinsey and others, basically using several models, making them interoperable. So we can, at the national level, model the co-benefits and trade-off with the SDGs and the net zero transition with 50 key indicators. So we're going to do 3 in-depth countries this year and then 15 more broader. We're presenting that tomorrow to the Aid for Trade review as a concept, but also what we want to develop. We've reviewed 60 developing countries NDCs, not as much the NAPs. So would welcome the work that you've done on the NAPs and see how much they use trade and investment measures. They mostly don't, not to the level that they could. And then what we want to do, and get back to what you're mentioning, Caroline, is, okay, then there's this much that these countries can do at the national level, but there's this whole thing here they can't do. So what do the international community needs to do on trade and investment that is cross-border? Same with technology. I mean, I know there's supposed to be a place where the technology is being done, but I'd be curious to see who's doing on this, because presumably the technologies needed for the transition are hosted in, multinational in what, a handful or 2 handful of countries. And then in the negotiation in New York, it's always about transfer of technology on mutually agreed terms. What does that mean? Who mutually agrees? And is it the companies? Is it the countries? That we let the Cameroon of the world negotiate with the multinational? You bring them together once you have the NDCs and say, and the NAPs and the VNR and the whatever, and say, look, we need a 3-tier, 4-tier system where this technology needs to be made available, and then a decision on who's going to pay and how they pay. It doesn't mean the developing country gets for free, but they should, the lower the income, presumably the lower they should pay, and then who pays the difference?
Thank you very much, Chantaline. Looking forward to hearing more about that new initiative tomorrow as well. I have Laura Kelly online from IED. And I know at IED, they've been very much working in the climate context with a group of least developed countries as well. So hopefully you can bring some of that perspective for us, Laura.
Great, thank you. Really interesting to hear this discussion and agree an awful lot with what's been said. I've got 3 sort of concrete ideas for ways forward, as that's what you were sort of calling for. And it does sort of draw on our work with the LDCs in the climate negotiations. And a little sort of anecdote. I was at the IMF World Bank Spring meetings this year, and we were trying to organise an event on climate finance. And we spoke to some of our LDC colleagues, trying to encourage them to see if they could get somebody from their climate or their environment ministries to join the missions, delegations going to Washington, so we could involve them in the discussion. And none of them were going. It was all finance ministries, central banks, and so on. So to me, that's a really great example of how these discussions are siloed. You've got a discussion about climate finance going on in the UNFCCC, and the money particularly the multilateral financing, the IMF and the World Bank, and the discussions are delinked. So picking up on that, I think, as we've also been hearing, there's all these different plans. Countries have development plans, they have NAPs, they have NDCs. We really need to find a way to bring these back together. And I think the IMF and the World Bank do have quite a big role to play here, because they do sustainability analysis, they do country plans. They also do quite a lot of work to bring donors together in country. I used to work in DFID, and we did a lot of work at the country level, and things like the DTIS on trade, really trying to bring the ministries together. So I think that there's a sort of a concrete push forward that could happen here. And I think there's more appetite now for this in the IMF and the World Bank with their new heads. Second area, picking up on this idea of champions, I really agree that this is something that's important, and where people can have a cross-government remit, that can really help. So people who are embedded in the Prime Minister or the President's office and work across government. People may be aware that a number of countries have climate envoys, and I was lucky enough to join a sort of a retreat session amongst some of the EU climate envoys a few weeks ago. And that's, they were really talking about these issues in a sort of a joined up way. But interestingly, they also had sort of silos within their own administrations. Sometimes they came out of finance, sometimes they came out of environmental climate departments. So they were also highlighting the need for developed and industrialized countries to be making these links better. And then my third point is actually around the sort of the supply chains and how trade actually happens. We do quite a lot of work at IID with small scale producers who are often at the end of global value chains. Some of the companies that we work with, they're seeing the climate risks, they're seeing variability in supply, they're seeing variations in the sort of the prices of the goods that they're sourcing, and they want to mitigate those risks. So they're taking actions, some of the leading companies, to really try and address some of those concerns through their supply chains. We've just finished some work which we're about to publish with Primark, so a clothing firm which has often had quite a bad reputation for sort of social and environmental impacts along its supply chain, but it's really looking at how it can work with cotton producers in southern India to help make their activities more climate resilient. So I think that there's something there as well for sort of actually the role of the private sector, which isn't necessarily driven by a particular policy or sort of international negotiations driver, but actually just about what makes good business sense. So yeah, really interested to be part of this conversation. I hope those are sort of 3 ideas for concrete ways forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura. I see Courtney also online from ODI.
Yes, not sure why I don't know if my camera is on. Anyway, just a couple of points. Some very interesting points have been made all morning, and one of them really, struck out to me. It's the sense that the point that that infrastructure being built in developing countries aren't being built to withstand the impacts of climate change. And this SID, small island developing states, this is a point that some of them would get really defensive about, especially because in this case, it's not for want of trying. Now, to use an example, in Antigua, there's a major roadway that leads into the city, and it got flooded, and major damage was occurred to it. And so, they brought their best engineers in and scientists to decide how can we rebuild this bridge, because the loss of the bridge was to the detriment of the economy. So they decided to build a taller, stronger bridge, a couple of feet higher than it was previously, and say to themselves, satisfied at the end, that there is no way that this bridge can be destroyed in the next flooding. Well, lo and behold, they were wrong. So what we see is that the impact of climate change is really, it seems as if even technology and infrastructure isn't keeping up with the impact it's having. But one of the things that we need to remember is that infrastructure building after each disaster, especially for SIDS, is financed by debt. And so we have these countries such as Antigua that is heavily indebted and currently in arrears
to many countries that are part of the Paris group. Now, this country would have gone to the Paris group to say, how can we negotiate on this debt because we are in arrears? But they were sent to the IMF. Now, any Caribbean country that has experience with the IMF would not blame Antigua for not wanting to go to the IMF. So we find that these countries are trapped in a debt against cycle. And an interesting point was made earlier to say that it's not just the disasters that make the headline that we need to pay attention to. We need to really look at the disasters that happen every 6 months that we don't hear about and the cumulative effect that this is having on these countries, on their economy, but most of all on the debt issue. So how does this then relate to trade? We need to think about these countries diversifying, because most of these countries over the years since 2000, since 1994 actually, have doubled down on services. And this is what most of them now have. We saw where the WTO in 1994, to the interest of multinational companies, decimated the banana industries in many cities, leaving them with just tourism alone. So how can we talk about diversification when there are no proper special and differential treatments for these countries to be able to diversify? And so they have to be relying on debt constantly because tourism is just not a high enough income earner for them to fund their own adaptation. So how exactly is trade going to come in and even and help to increase these economies' earnings so that they can fund their own resilience building? How will the international environment assist with technology transfer? Good point made by Chantel earlier. We can't leave small island developing states at the mercy of multinational companies with their legions of lawyers and investment bankers, etc., because they simply don't have the capacity to negotiate with them. So how do we then develop the negotiating capacity of SIDS to have conversations and agreements with multinational firms without the WTO coming in to assist them in order to do so? Because we already see that even in the tourism industry, SIDS are at the mercy of big hotels who come in and hardly pay any corporate taxes, and most of the tourism earnings flow back out of the country. We also know that these countries are enclaved economies because they import everything that feeds into the tourism sector. So there are no backward and forward linkages. I guess the point I'm really trying to make is that we really need to do a holistic look at the trade environment to see where we can create carve out for SIDS and where we can help them to diversify in order to fund their own adaptation, because that is not going to cut it, and having a single dependence on tourism is just not going to cut it. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Courtney, for all of those comments. Just before I turn back to the floor, I know that Ambassador Ehef has to leave in just a minute. I just wanted to check if you wanted to say anything else before going, Ambassador.
Yes, first of all, thank you, but I think I wanted to say that this is a very initiative, this is a very thoughtful discussion that we have. It's very important that we develop, we contribute, we bring inputs in these specific thematics to regulate international trade, more equity, more transparency, as the earlier speakers has just said, because what she described, we are facing all these difficulties all over the world, because sometimes we need technical assistance. There are some, as I earlier talked about, the new measures were taken. More developing countries are not involved, are not well equipped to face all these challenges, which constitute the process of the international trade. And the issue of climate, the issue of environment is very important. And as I described, it's a lot of disequilibrium, a lot of imbalance, a lot of inequality. So I think these discussions are very thoughtful, because it's going to, I think, contribute to reinforce the dialogue, contribute to reinforce trust among negotiators. And there are certain principles that she described has to be taken into consideration, like the S&DT, which is very, very important. I think we need a fair trade, we need an equitable trade. If we have this, the same objective, the well-being of the whole mankind is very, very important, and we have to take in consideration the differences between nations, and so that we can construct an inclusive economy and equitable trade.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your time. I think just to follow on Jodi's point, I think you can count on the support of many of those here in the different organizations. If on the road to MC14 in Cameroon, you would like to have support for some dialogue on these topics in the lead up, we'd be very happy to support you and your government in that process.
Thank you. I will. I think it's very, it is very, I think. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
So just wanted to check back, and you spoke very much at the beginning. Is there, just to come back into discussion, is there anything else that you wanted to add, having heard?
So I think that for me, it's clear that there are different different and similar challenges happening at two levels, right? So we're talking about sort of international regime and how they can better speak to each other and collaborate. And then there's what's happening at a country, possibly even at a regional level, and the solutions that we can propose there. And I think we've identified, needs and solutions at both levels, like figuring out how to break down silos, have more sort of coherence and collaboration. I mean, these might feel like sort of overly cited solutions, but I think there are practical ways of making them happen. And I think that's, for me, that's a next step, like thinking we're going to be working at the national level over the next couple of years. And what are some of the practical steps that can be taken in a country to break down these silos and have these conversations and have somebody from the trade ministry sit with the adaptation team and just look through the priorities and figure, do a bit of a mapping. Like there are practical solutions that can be taken. So I think trying to figure out the sort of bite-sized pieces to getting this collaboration and this coherence in play is going to be really important to take that next step. One thing that I've been thinking about, and unfortunately, Ambassador Hussein left, but and I'm not sure if I understood him correctly, him saying that we would probably have more luck looking or searching for solutions or taking the next step under the climate regime than in the WTO. And I would caution against that because the climate regime in many ways is as dysfunctional as the WTO. And so just thinking that we're going to be able to sort of send a bunch of trade ministers to UNFCCC negotiations and that we'll figure it out, like it's not going to happen that way, right? So I think we need to look for openings in both. Now, WTO might in some ways be contentious in different ways than it is in UNFCCC, but we even saw these intersessional really long-standing dynamics. They're just not moving. The common and differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities issue is a huge dividing line between parties right now. And, ambition is being hijacked by, climate action ambition is being hijacked by historical sort of responsibilities and demands or expectations around finance. This is the year of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. It's also the year of ambition, and it's after the sort of moment of Paris, we're sort of seeing these dividing lines coming back. And so all this to say is, let's not put all of our eggs into the UNFCCC basket to help us sort of move this agenda forward. I think it's going to happen in both. Look for those practical entry points and then recognize that there are different steps to be taken at these different levels, at the regime level, but also nationally within countries as well. And then hopefully a bit more regionally and transboundary challenges as well. So those are some of the thoughts that were in my head. Thanks.
Super, thank you, Anne. Any other reflections from those here in the room?
Yes, actually, I was thinking on all that have been said, and I fully endorse what have been said, especially from the lady who is online. I believe she's from one of the seats that I assume. Solutions has been found. I mean, through the years, we have a lot of plans. And the problem is we don't have ways to implement that. And it will end up on the financing and the political will from others, from partners, other countries. And I don't know, for me, the political will is the most important, because I was thinking of our kind of cooperation that we found in Portugal. The conversion of debt to finance climate projects. So this would be one of the solutions for us. And but also the political will from countries to finance. I was wondering, is there an estimate of how much is spent globally on military expenditures and wars, and whether this amount would serve to cover part of all of the prevention, mitigation, and all this adaptation and measures that we've already identified? So that's my reflection.
Thank you very much, Carla. Turn to you.
Thank you. Just moving forward, I think in terms of solutions, Pacific Island countries, including Vanuatu, we have our political leaders that initially agreed that we would definitely pursue the development of a regional strategy for an environment, which is the regions are working on that. In terms of adaptation and resilience, our vulnerability of the small island economies in the Pacific and the adaptation. So I think most countries in the Pacific fall back to traditional knowledge. That is something that perhaps maybe I'm not too sure in other Western countries, but for the Pacific, we seems to be falling back. I would say for first the indigenous lands in the Pacific, mostly the leased lands are only around 5%. And if you look at access to traditional land in the Pacific is almost up to 80 to 90%. Traditional land owners will have access to those land. And it's for humanity and the human index. My small country, which is very vulnerable, it's the happiest place on earth, voted twice, 3 times. It's the most vulnerable country in the Pacific, in the world. And the traditional, I would say the traditional practice, we fall back in terms of creating food baskets and in the island trade between different islands. It's something to sustain livelihood, which is, yes, Vanuatu and other Pacific Island countries will rely on food supplies that comes in as an immediate response. But the stability of adaptation measures, which our people and large people in the Pacific who have lived with that, it's the traditional economy that we would like to safeguard and to maintain that. And I think we wanted to work with UNCTAD on developing byproducts to help communities generate income opportunities to mitigate some of the risk in terms of climate finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Radhika. I mean, it's a really good reflection. It links a little bit with what Carla from Cabo Verde was saying earlier about the risks if you're a food importing country and how can we build resilience in that context. And in your case, I mean, you have the capacity or resources or knowledge nationally to try and mitigate some of those risks by supporting traditional knowledge and resilience practices nationally. Maybe not all countries have the capacity to do that. I guess it depends on your endowments as well. But over to you, Radhika, please.
Thank you. Picking up on the point Anna mentioned about the international coordination. I hope I understood you correctly. So we have given you the example of national coordination. When you talk about international coordination, it's really mind-boggling. I'll just give you one example. Climate finance. This is an area I'm closely working on. So you have a plethora of sort of funding mechanism, Adaptation Fund, LDC Fund, Green Climate Fund, then you have the GEF also providing support, then Regional Development Bank, international financial institutions, bilateral, private sector, ESG investors, blended finance players. Look at them. So you have a plethora of investors, right, ready to provide finance. And then, this actually could create a lot of duplication in terms of funding. And we are talking about the fact that we have limited resources, and then we have to put the money where the mouth is. But at the same time, there's a plethora of institutions who is acting as a coordinating platform. Is there a forum that coordinates? No, right? And then, avoiding duplication is one thing, but another missed opportunity would be to achieve synergy between various, financing instruments, because, in many countries, I've already, seen the example of some of these cross-border electricity transmission line being funded partly through the government resources, partly by the bilateral donors grant, and partly by loan. All of that mechanisms do exist already. And that's the example of synergy. If we don't do that, then we miss that opportunity also. So two challenges, duplication and missed opportunity of synergy. So my suggestion would be, one recommendation would be, if you feel like including, would be similar to the Aid for Trade initiative at the WTO, where we have at least, many donors providing, different kinds of support to countries, but there is a monitoring mechanism, that is managed by the WTO Secretariat and OECD Secretariat, and done on a bilateral basis. They produce Aid for Trade at a glance, sort of biennial basis, produce Aid for Trade at a glance report, and also organize a global review like this. So what about climate finance global review or climate finance initiative, just to coordinate? I mean, nothing beyond that, just to coordinate. And that could be, something, we are probably thinking of kind of, a challenge that we already face right now. But in 10 years, this would be a huge, humongous challenge that we would not be able to solve.
Thank you. It would also be a way of identifying where the gaps are, because from what we've heard today, also there are areas that are persistent gaps, right? No matter what, and that might be a way to highlight that. So I'm just going to check if there's any final comments that anyone wanted to make, and if not, yes, Chantal.
If you don't mind, just building on that, I think we're up against one major constraint, which is there has been a concern, rightfully so, from developing countries that if you start talking about climate finance and development finance, they need to be additive. And of course, there's no new money. So there's a real concern there. There's very little new funds being put in place. So I think making sure that distinction is made is very important. And it creates the fragmentation in the financing. And there's two other fragmentation that are preventing the work going forward. Is a fragmentation in knowledge, which WTO work on some things, each one are working on something. We have definite fragmentation in knowledge, but also in governance. And so again, I think it's one of the things that we've proposed, and the paper is finally coming out, is a paper we wrote for just and green transition for the G20. And because we're talking about, climate is all about national. So you talk about just transition between the people in your countries, but there's just transition at the global level. And it was requested under the Indian presidency because they wanted to see what just transition meant at the global level, while the other countries want to focus only on national level. So we have quite a few recommendations there. And I think the importance of the G20 is because you can't bring all the trade ministers to COP and the COP to the trade, and but the G20, if they get it, can at least have some of that discussion at that level and have that governance at least at that level. But finally, on diversification of the economy, I think Courtney and others mentioned it. What we started looking under the global system of trade preferences, which developing countries have agreed to, is South-South trade in environmental goods and services, because sometimes it's getting harder and harder to meet the standard of developed countries on food, on many other things, including on energy now. But amongst themselves, and each one of them may not have the market and may not have all of the capacity, national capacity, but together they would to hold the whole supply chain on renewable, on some of these technologies that they need, and on the food that they need to produce. So I think we should not underestimate the South-South trade in environmental goods and services to address the technology, the food, and other issues that developing countries are facing.
Thank you, Chantaline. And actually, that was a point that DG Rand has made in his comment, also the importance of South-South cooperation in this space. So I think that as I don't see any more hands, I'm going to move towards, oh, yes, please, Josefina.
Yes, thank you, Caroline, and thank you to all the presentations and everyone that has contributed today. Just building on the issue of discussions in WTO, in UNFCCC, and how we see this, I think for member states, it's not only about what works better, but also as to what principles are recognized where and how you can discuss within the framework of those principles in the different organizations, and also as to how you group yourself and what type of groupings negotiate in each. And this really impacts the way the force in which you can use your arguments and put forward the different proposals, because we know in UNFCCC there are different groupings, there's G77, there is a lot of different ways of moving forward for developing countries, and that becomes much more difficult and less possible in WTO. And also what we have seen in the last ministerials is that when we come to WTO and we want to move forward in environmental issues, like Ambassador of Pakistan was explaining, that we only have a paragraph in the outcome document, whilst we started with much more, then we start with a lot of exchanges. And the exchanges, as everyone knows in WTO, sometimes have nothing to do with, one thing with the other. It's just chips that start being exchanged. So that might also be a problem as to where you discuss one issue or the other. And then listening to Chantaline, I was also thinking of, well, you had also a seminar on Friday, quite interesting, on the issue of harmful subsidies. What we've been saying together with other members is that, if all those subsidies are being provided in some members were, diverted to climate finance, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we are today regarding means of implementation and climate finance.
Thank you very much, Josefina, also for some of the political context as well as to how countries approach these issues. So we have just a few minutes to go. So just before I wrap up, I wanted to make sure I thank my colleague Yasmin Ismail and also Christophe and Eugene for making this meeting possible today. So it's really their work in getting everyone together. And I would also like to thank our speakers, and particularly our colleagues from Vanuatu, who have got the prize for having traveled the furthest to be here in Geneva, by far the furthest. And also for always reminding us of the urgency of these issues for countries. I mean, it's a context which we mustn't forget. That the challenges facing countries are significant and urgent to be addressed. So I think, just in terms of wrapping up, for us, a core reason for hosting this discussion today was to explore how we can elevate a little bit the attention to issues of adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience in the trade discussion, or the multilateral setting and discussions around trade and climate. So I think overall, this discussion has highlighted that we do need more attention to these issues. I'm happy that we have some countries and brilliant colleagues here and organizations who are already working on this, and hopefully we can find ways to work together, different formats, informally or in partnerships, to sort of elevate this part of the discussion. There's a lot in there that we've unpacked today. There's elements of what needs to be done and could be done more nationally, using some of the mechanisms, such as the national adaptation plans and so on. But I think there's a lot of work to be done just in terms of building a political narrative around the importance of these issues. And I go there to Carla's point around political will. That one does need to tell a broad story that the risks and impacts on countries and the trade dimensions of those, the role of trade in addressing those, the need for partnerships around this is something that needs to be a more central part of the trade and climate discussion, is a narrative that needs a lot more attention. But beyond the narrative, of course, there's a need to do something practical about that. But I think we sort of need to play that two-level game. And I won't go through all of the issues that have come up today, but I think some of the things that really struck me was that also when talking about issues of adaptation and vulnerability, they're not really a separate pillar to the mitigation issues. There's linkages between them, and I would thank Jody for really emphasizing the green squeeze idea, and for giving that example from Ethiopia, that these issues, new tensions may be created. So we need to think about these not in silos either, that they're connected issues. And then I think that, Courtney made a great appeal for the importance of looking at issues of trade and climate in the context of wider issues around not just finance, but also debt. And seeing that that's in the WTO context, we have a working group on trade, debt, and finance. Others here have raised important issues around technology as being central in this discussion. So we have processes around those as well that we could hook into. Back in the first session, I thought it was interesting that we had very concrete issues around trade-related infrastructure and how that affects, impacts on trade-related infrastructure, what can be done to build resilience of that in order to be able to build resilient supply chains and so on, be part of resilient supply chains in the long run. But alongside, I think Matthew really emphasized the impacts on key productive sectors. And then I think, Courtney and others raised the impact that there are impacts on agriculture and fisheries that are key to the export rates in the country, but also on tourism. And also I think he pushed us to think about beyond tourism, what is it that some of these countries can do in other sectors to build their sort of economic sustainability over time. I really took the point that we talk a lot about the idea that countries facing climate impacts will face issues around food security, and the trade will have a role in addressing those, making sure that countries have access to the food baskets that they need. And then I thought the contribution from Vanuatu is really insightful to look also at the fact that it may change how we tend to think in the trade arena of the importance of trade as filling in food gaps. But if you can't get the products at the time you need, you're cut off from world markets, then you need to have resilience at home as well, and there'll be strategies for building that as well. So anyway, there's so many issues in there, but what I do think is worth doing is thinking about, and actually just looking at Loretta, also this element, and I think for countries like Pakistan, we have to look at what are the entry points that governments are willing to work on as well. For them, this issue of disaster response and preparedness and a trading system that enables countries to take action that they need to is something we really need to look at as part of the story as well. And I liked your language around, was it climate sensitive and risk informed trade strategy? And that's a nice, I thought that's a nice sort of conceptual approach as well. So just closing for today, I think what would be fantastic is for all of us to keep in contact around these sort of climate trade, vulnerability issues, to look at what a sort of positive agenda might look like in this space. I think it's not going to be simple. I think it's a multifaceted agenda, but I think it will be really worth continuing to work together, find ways to raise the profile of these issues. It might be through collections of papers or separate papers or something that could be done to really highlight these issues going forward in ways that ultimately support the countries at the front line of the climate crisis. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you. Really glad to have made it.
With the question.